They said the truth never dies. It only gets buried. But what happens when the people who buried it own half the government, control 3 aerospace companies, and have spent 20 years making sure the one man who knew the truth simply ceased to exist? Tonight, in the middle of a storm that's tearing the sky apart, a private jet carrying $1 billion secret is about to land on a runway that's not supposed to be open. And the man standing beneath those lights, wrench in one hand, flashlight in the other, has no idea that everything he lost is about to come screaming back at him. Don't go anywhere. Hit that like button, drop your city in the comments, and let's see how far this story travels. Now, let's get into it. The first thing Ethan Mercer noticed about the storm wasn't the lightning, it was the silence before it. He'd been out on the east end of the runway for about 40 minutes, crouched over a corroded junction box with a headlamp strapped to his forehead and a coffee thermos wedged between his knees. And the whole time the August night had been thick and hot and completely still. No crickets, no wind moving through the tall grass on either side of the tarmac, just that heavy, suffocating quiet that sits on top of you like a wool blanket in July. Then the sky cracked open. Not gradually, not with distant rumbling that gave you time to pack up your tools and jog back to shelter. It just split. 1 second nothing, the next second a sheet of white light that turned the entire airfield blue-white for a full 3 seconds, and then thunder so loud Ethan felt it in his back teeth. "Fantastic," he said to no one. He grabbed the thermos, shoved his tools into the canvas bag beside him, and stood up just as the rain started. Not drizzle, not a warning. The kind of rain that hits you like someone turned on a fire hose directly above your head. In under 10 seconds, he was soaked through his flannel shirt, through his undershirt, his jeans heavy against his legs. He started moving back toward the main hangar at a jog, holding the tool bag over his head for whatever good that did, which was none. Millhaven Airfield sat on the western edge of Crescent County, about 40 minutes outside of Ashford, Georgia. It had been closed for 11 years. Before that, it had operated as a regional charter hub for about 6 years. Before that, before the charter company, before the county acquired it in a foreclosure, before the FAA pulled its operating certificate, it had been something else entirely. Something that nobody local seemed to know much about and nobody outside seemed to want to talk about. Ethan had bought it 3 months ago for $240,000, which was roughly the price of a nice used RV, and which had represented almost everything he had in the world. People thought he was having some kind of breakdown. His sister Donna had called him from Phoenix the week after the sale closed and said, very carefully, "The way you talk to someone you're worried about, Ethan, honey, you bought an airport." "Airfield," he'd corrected. "There's a difference?" "Yeah. An airport has a control tower. This has a building that used to be a control tower. Different thing." She hadn't found that funny. His buddy Marcus, who he'd known since their army days and who now ran a machine shop outside Ashford, had driven out to look at the property with him in May and spent about 20 minutes walking around not saying anything, just nodding slowly the way people do when they don't want to say what they're actually thinking. Finally, he'd said, "Man, you sure about this?" "Not even a little bit," Ethan had told him, "but I'm doing it anyway." That was the most honest answer he'd given anyone in a long time. The truth, the real truth, the one he hadn't told Donna or Marcus or anyone else, was that buying Millhaven Airfield wasn't about having a plan. It wasn't even really about the aviation training center he'd started telling people about, the one where kids from working families could learn to fly without taking on $100,000 in debt. That part was real. He meant it. But it wasn't why he'd signed those papers. He'd bought it because standing on that runway the first time, the afternoon the county agent had taken him out to walk the property, something had happened that he couldn't explain and hadn't tried to. He'd stood there on the cracked asphalt with weeds growing up through every joint and the old windsock hanging limp and rotten from its pole, and he'd felt recognition. Like he'd been here before, like the place knew him and was waiting, which was a crazy thing to feel about a piece of abandoned infrastructure in rural Georgia, and he knew it, and he'd signed the papers anyway. That had been 3 months ago. Since then, he'd been living in a second-hand travel trailer parked next to the main hangar, working during the day on whatever project had the highest urgency, which changed constantly, and sleeping badly and calling his daughter Cora every evening at 8 o'clock. Cora was 19, studying aerospace engineering at Georgia Tech, and she thought his project was either insane or inspired. She hadn't decided which yet. Her words. Maybe both, she'd said on their last call, and he'd heard the smile in it, and that had been enough. He reached the hangar door, yanked it open, and ducked inside. The rain hammering on the metal roof was so loud he could feel it more than hear it. He dropped the tool bag, pulled his soaked shirt away from his chest, and looked out through the side window at the airfield. That's when he saw the lights. At first he thought it was lightning reflection off the wet tarmac. Then he thought maybe a car had pulled onto the access road. But the lights were moving in the wrong direction for that, and they were too high, and they were moving in a pattern he recognized without meaning to. Approach lights. Something was trying to land. What the? He pressed closer to the window. Through the rain and the dark, he could make out the shape now, or start to. The silhouette of an aircraft on final approach, way too low, descending at an angle that made his stomach tighten. No active runway lights, no VASI, no anything. Just a jet coming down in the dark toward a strip of cracked asphalt that hadn't been cleared for landings in over a decade. Ethan wasn't a pilot. He'd never been a pilot, but he'd spent years of his life working on the systems that kept aircraft in the air, and every one of those years had given him a set of instincts that didn't shut off just because he'd left the industry. What he was seeing right now was a plane in serious trouble, trying to put itself down on a runway it almost certainly didn't know was compromised. He was already moving before he'd made the decision. The emergency kit was on the shelf by the main door. He'd put it there his first week on the property, mostly out of habit, the same way he'd taped the contact numbers for the county fire station and the nearest hospital on the wall above it. He grabbed 2 road flares, cracked them both, and ran back out into the rain. The noise of the aircraft was audible now over the storm, the high whine of turbofan engines at low power, that particular sound that means descent, not cruise. He ran to the center line of the runway and planted the flares about 60 feet apart, then sprinted back toward the approach end. The aircraft was close enough that he could see the nav lights clearly now, green on the right wingtip, red on the left, white at the tail. Small jet. Business class. Single aisle. It was coming down fast, too fast maybe, and too far right of center, and there was a section of runway about 2,000 feet down that had heaved up 3 or 4 inches, where tree roots had gotten underneath the asphalt, and if the pilot didn't know about it and came in at that angle. Ethan grabbed his phone, pulled up his flashlight, and started moving it in the pattern he'd learned a long time ago without even thinking about why he remembered it. Slow left, slow right, steady. The universal ground signal for shift left, correct your line. He didn't know if the pilots could see him through the rain. He didn't know if they'd understand what they were seeing if they did. He did it anyway. For about 4 seconds, nothing changed, and he was already calculating how far he'd need to run to get clear if the aircraft went off the edge. And then, the nose shifted. Subtly. 2 or 3 degrees. But enough. The aircraft crossed the threshold about 15 feet left of where it had been tracking, which put it dead center, and it touched down with a hard double thump that he felt through the soles of his boots, both mains simultaneously, and then the nose came down and the thrust reversers opened up with a roar that competed with the thunder, and the aircraft slowed and slowed and slowed and stopped, about 300 feet from the far end of the runway. Ethan stood in the rain and breathed. His hands were shaking. He noticed that and put them in his pockets. The aircraft sat there with its engines spooling down, navigation lights still blinking, rain sheeting off the fuselage. It was a Cessna Citation, one of the larger variants, a longitude maybe, he thought, though in the dark and the rain it was hard to be sure. White with a dark stripe along the lower fuselage, no visible tail number from where he was standing. He walked toward it. The air stair door opened before he was halfway there. A woman came down the steps. No umbrella, no rain jacket. She was wearing what looked like a dark blazer over a silk blouse, and both were soaked within 3 seconds of her stepping out. But she moved like someone who'd decided some time ago that weather was a problem for other people. She was carrying a briefcase in her left hand, one of those slim aluminum ones that looked like it had a combination lock, and she had it gripped so tight her knuckles were probably white, but he couldn't see that from here. She was looking right at him. "Are you the one who moved the flares?" she called. Her voice was clear even over the rain and the wind, not raised exactly, just projected. the voice of someone used to being heard. "Yeah," Ethan said. "Good." She walked toward him, closing the distance between them with a stride that was purposeful enough to be almost aggressive. Up close, she was younger than he'd initially clocked, early 30s maybe, dark hair plastered flat by the rain now, sharp-featured in a way that photographs would probably call severe and real life called striking. She was looking at him like she was making a rapid series of calculations and hadn't decided what she thought of the result yet. "This is Millhaven Airfield," she said. "What's left of it? And you own it?" "For about 3 months." She nodded once, like this confirmed something. "We need to get inside. My pilot has a possible broken wrist from the landing. The yoke kicked back hard on rollout, and I need to make a call." "Okay," Ethan said. "Yeah, come on." He turned back toward the hangar, and she fell into step beside him. From behind him, he heard footsteps on the air stair. The co-pilot, probably, helping the pilot down. He glanced back. 2 men in dark shirts descending carefully. "Your pilot? He needs a doctor?" Ethan asked. "I've already called for one. They'll meet us at the hangar." She said this like she'd organized it during the 90 seconds of landing roll, which, knowing the type, she probably had. "What were you doing trying to land here?" he asked. "This runway's not active. There's no NOTAM, no lighting." "I know that." "Then why—" "Because I needed a runway that wasn't on a flight plan," she said flatly, "and because this one was supposed to be empty." She said supposed to be in a way that suggested his being here was a complication she was already incorporating into her plans, not one that had thrown her. He found that slightly irritating. They reached the hangar. He pulled the door open and gestured them inside, and she walked through without pausing. He followed her in and switched on the main work lights, the big fluorescents that hung from the crossbeams, and the hangar came up in that hard white light that shows everything. The tool chests along the wall, the second-hand pickup he used as a work vehicle, the folding table with his drawings and survey maps spread across it, the coffee maker on the shelf that he'd bought at a Goodwill in Ashford, because he'd discovered early on that this project was a 3 pots a day kind of endeavor. The woman stopped in the middle of the hangar floor and looked around. Her expression was, he wasn't sure. Not what he'd expected, not the mild distaste of someone who'd ended up somewhere beneath their usual standard. Something more complicated. "Sit down if you want," he said. "There's coffee if you—" "Vivian Sterling," she said. She turned to face him and said it the way people say their name when they expect it to mean something. "And you're Ethan Mercer." He stopped. "You know my name?" "I've known your name for 4 months." She set the briefcase down on his folding table, very carefully, in a space between the maps. "Finding you took about 6 weeks longer than I expected." "Finding me?" he repeated. "I'm not lost. I'm on the county property records." "That's not where I was looking." She reached into the inside pocket of her blazer and produced an envelope, cream-colored, sealed, with visible water damage from the rain. She held it out to him. "My father left me this. He died 8 weeks ago. I'm told he spent the last 2 years of his life trying to find you." Ethan didn't take the envelope. Not yet. "Who was your father?" "Robert Sterling." The name landed on him like something physical. He took a step back before he was aware of doing it, and his heel caught the leg of the rolling stool behind him, and it scraped back across the concrete floor with a sound like a coin dropped in a church. Robert Sterling had been the founder and CEO of Sterling Aerospace Systems. Had been, before a series of board maneuvers and a restructuring that the financial press had called turbulent, had stripped him of his title about 6 years ago. Had been, before his death 2 months ago, from what the obituaries had called complications following a long illness. Sterling Aerospace Systems had, for about 4 years in the early 2000s, operated a classified advanced avionics research division out of he didn't know where. Nobody had known where exactly. That had been the point. Ethan knew the name Robert Sterling the way you know the name of the person who burned your life down. Not because Sterling had done it to him personally, because the company Sterling built had employed the people who had. "I know who your father was," Ethan said. His voice came out very level, and he was proud of that. "Why are you here?" Vivian Sterling looked at him steadily. Outside, the storm was still going, rain hammering the roof, and somewhere behind her the 2 crew members had come in, and one of them was holding his right wrist carefully against his chest. Because he told me, she said, that beneath this airfield, beneath this specific piece of ground, there's something buried that can prove what they did to you. She paused. And because before they find out I have this briefcase, I need your help to get to it. Ethan looked at her for a long moment. Then he looked at the envelope she was still holding out. Then he looked at the concrete floor beneath their feet. Who's they? He said. The people who are going to run my company into the ground if I don't stop them, she said. The same people who destroyed your career. They're not the same individuals. Some of them are. But it's the same machine. He still didn't take the envelope. How do I know you're not part of that machine? Something flickered across her face that he couldn't quite read. Not offense. Not exactly. More like a calculation being revised. You don't, she said. Not yet. But I came here in the middle of a storm, on a runway that wasn't lit, without telling anyone where I was going, carrying evidence that certain people would pay a significant amount of money to have destroyed. If I were part of the machine, she said, I'd have just let them destroy it. Ethan reached out and took the envelope. It was heavier than it looked. He didn't open it yet. He just stood there holding it, and the rain kept hammering the roof, and the wounded pilot sat down carefully on the folding chair that Ethan kept by the tool chest, and somewhere out on the field the 2 red flares he'd planted were still burning in the dark, small and stubborn in the middle of all that rain. Your pilot needs ice for that wrist, Ethan said finally. I've got a first aid kit. There's a gas station about 6 miles east that's open 24 hours if you need someone to drive him somewhere. Thank you. And I want to know everything, he said, before we do anything. Before I open whatever's in this envelope, I want to know everything you know. That's fair, Vivian said. It's not fair, he said. It's just what I need. She almost smiled at that. Almost. He went to get the first aid kit. Crowd. They talked for 3 hours. The storm went on for most of it, easing around 2 in the morning to a steady rain that tapped at the windows and made the kind of background noise that's easier to talk over than silence. Vivian's pilot, a compact, precise man named Garrett, who turned out to have a badly sprained rather than broken wrist, sat with an ice pack from Ethan's freezer and listened without contributing much. The co-pilot, a younger woman named Sue Yon, had gone back to the aircraft to run some systems checks and came back halfway through to report that everything was fine mechanically and then stayed to listen. Ethan made coffee, not because he expected to sleep. He knew he wasn't sleeping tonight, but because having something to do with his hands helped him listen better. He sat on the rolling stool, both feet flat on the floor, and listened to Vivian Sterling talk, and periodically he asked questions, and she answered them without hedging and without spin, or at least that was how it felt. He'd been lied to by people who were good at it. She didn't seem to be performing. What she told him went like this. Robert Sterling had started Sterling Aerospace Systems in 1987, built it over 15 years into one of the country's most significant private aerospace contractors. Military avionics, commercial systems integration, some classified defense work. In the late 1990s, he'd spun up a division, officially called the Advanced Systems Research Group, internally called ASRG, and in the handful of internal memos where it appeared by other names, called the Project, that was working on next-generation flight control software. The kind of software that was supposed to make aircraft smarter, more responsive, more autonomous in specific emergency scenarios. The project had hired some very talented engineers. One of them had been Ethan. Ethan said nothing when she mentioned this. He was watching the rain on the window. What my father told me, Vivian said, and what I found in the documents in this briefcase, is that the software had a flaw, a serious one. In a specific edge case scenario involving crosswind conditions and simultaneous autopilot disengagement, the system could enter what the engineers called a feedback loop. It would attempt to correct a control surface input, overcorrect, attempt to correct the overcorrection, and so on. In a real aircraft, in real conditions, a pilot would have somewhere between 4 and 7 seconds to recognize what was happening and manually override before the situation became unrecoverable. 4 seconds. Ethan said quietly. Sometimes less. He nodded. He was looking at his hands. You knew about it, she said. It wasn't a question. I flagged it, he said, twice formally, once informally to my direct supervisor. I wrote it up in engineering language, and I wrote it up in plain English, and I put both versions in front of the people whose job it was to decide what to do about things like that. And they decided to move forward anyway. They decided, he said, that the scenario I was describing was too edge case to represent a material risk, and that delaying deployment would cost the company its contract timeline, and that I was being what they actually wrote in the response email. I still have it somewhere, I think. They wrote that I was being overcautious to a degree that borders on obstructive. He said this last part in a flat voice, like he was reading from a document, because he basically was. Some things you don't forget the wording of. 6 months later, there was an accident. Vivian was quiet. 3 people, Ethan said. The pilot, a co-pilot, and 1 passenger who shouldn't have been on the aircraft at all. A tech rep who'd hitched a ride because the alternative was a 4-hour drive. He stopped. The NTSB investigation concluded pilot error, spatial disorientation in IMC. The investigation was managed, Vivian said. My father's documents include correspondence between 2 of the board members and the accident investigation contractor that Sterling Aerospace retained. The contractor's preliminary findings identified a possible software contribution. Those findings were revised before the final report. I know, Ethan said. I knew something had happened to the investigation. I could see it happening, but I didn't have... He stopped himself. I didn't have what I needed to prove it, and by the time the report came out, I'd been gone for 4 months. They fired you. They fired me, and then they made sure I couldn't get work, he said. Which is a different thing. Being fired, I could have survived. The other part took longer to figure out. He picked up his coffee mug, found it empty, set it back down. References that didn't check out. A performance review that appeared in my file that I never received and never signed. 1 contract offer withdrawn 2 days before I was supposed to start. No explanation given. He looked up at her. You understand, I wasn't an inexperienced kid. I had 12 years in the industry, 2 patents, a presentation at an IEEE conference. I wasn't easy to erase. But they managed it. Eventually. He was quiet for a second. My wife left. Not because of the job thing specifically, but it didn't help. Cora was 3. I retrained, did some community college, got a mechanics certificate, worked shops. It's a decent living. It's not what I was doing before. He said this last part without self-pity, which somehow made it worse. Vivian looked down at the briefcase on his table. There's more, she said. Not just about what they did to the investigation, or to you. There are documents in here suggesting that the software, modified, supposedly corrected, was sold anyway, to a different contractor. That there have been 2 subsequent incidents, neither of them fatal, but both unexplained in the official record, that may be related. Ethan was very still. That's what this is actually about, she said. It's not just about clearing your name. It's about a defect that may still be in service. She paused. My father spent the last 2 years of his life trying to track this down because he found out about it from someone inside the company, and it ate at him. He built that company. Whatever the board turned it into after he left, he built it. Her voice was steady, but something moved behind it. He wanted it fixed, and he wanted the people who buried it to face what they'd done. And the briefcase, Ethan said, has evidence of all of it. Engineering files he managed to preserve, some of the internal correspondence, a copy of the original accident investigation preliminary report before it was revised. She looked at him. But the strongest piece, the piece that can't be argued with, is apparently here, under this ground. The flight recorder. She nodded. According to what he found, what someone who worked the investigation told him before they died, the original flight recorder from the accident was never officially destroyed. It was moved, hidden. My father believed it's in a sealed facility that was built beneath this airfield during the years when Sterling Aerospace was operating a research station here. She watched his face carefully. You didn't know about that. I didn't know they used this specific location, he said slowly. There was a research station. I was there a few times. I don't know where it was. My father thought you might know more than you realized. She held his gaze. He thought that whoever chose this location chose it deliberately, That there may be reasons this place is connected to you that go beyond coincidence. Ethan said nothing to that. He got up and refilled his coffee, and he stood at the coffee maker for a moment with his back to the room, and he thought about the afternoon in May when he'd stood on that runway and felt something he hadn't been able to name. Recognition. Like the place knew him. Maybe it hadn't been the place. Maybe it had been the thing underneath it. "I need to see the documents," he said, turning back. "Of course. And I need a day to think." "I can give you that," she said. Then, "I should tell you, I don't know how long before they realize I've left with this case. There are people monitoring me. They know I've been looking into this since my father died. I've had 2 lawyers contact me offering to mediate various disputed aspects of the estate on behalf of board members who are now trying to consolidate control of the company." She said this very precisely. "The lawyers don't know about the briefcase, but the board members who sent them might suspect I found something. And when they figure out you're not in New York, they'll start looking." She paused. "Probably 24 to 36 hours before they have a reasonable idea of where I might be. Possibly less." "Great," Ethan said. He sat back down. He opened the envelope she'd given him. Inside was a single sheet of cream paper, handwritten, the penmanship of an older man who'd been meticulous about it. The ink had bled slightly in 2 places from the rain, but was still legible. He read it once, quickly. Then he read it again. The letter was addressed to him by name. It said, among other things, "I knew who you were before my daughter did. I should have known sooner. I should have done something sooner. That is the only thing I need you to understand before anything else. I knew what my company did to you, and I did not stop it, and I have not been able to forgive myself for that since the day I found out. What I am giving you now cannot undo that, but I hope it can give you something back." The last line read, "The hangar below the ground was built in 2001. The access point is beneath the western tie-down pad. Ethan, your name is on the aircraft inside it. I don't think they knew that when they hit it there. I don't think they were paying enough attention to you even then. That was always their mistake." Ethan folded the letter back into the envelope and set it on the table beside his coffee mug. "Okay," he said. Vivian looked at him. "Okay?" she repeated. "We'll look for it." He held up one finger. "One condition. Whatever we find, I decide what we do with it. Not you, not your board, not your lawyers, me. It was my work and it was my life, and I'm going to be the one who decides what to do with the truth." She looked at him for a long moment. He could see her working through it, calculating. The kind of woman, he thought, who was used to being the one who set the terms. "All right," she said finally. "Just like that?" "My father trusted you enough to spend 2 years looking for you," she said. "That's good enough for me." He didn't say anything to that. He looked out the window. The rain had gone down to a drizzle, and through it he could just see the far end of the runway, the dark asphalt, the tall grass on either side. And somewhere under the western tie-down pad, under concrete, under 20 years of settled earth, something was waiting. Something with his name on it. He thought about Cora, 19 years old and studying aerospace engineering at Georgia Tech. Studying it because of him, because he'd made it sound like the best thing a person could do with their life, made it sound like that back before everything had fallen apart. He thought about 3 people in an aircraft that went down in bad weather, and the report that said pilot error. He thought about the word overcautious. He stood up. "Get some sleep if you can," he said to Vivian and her crew. "There are a couple of cots in the back office. Use them." He picked up his flashlight. "I'll be outside." "What are you doing outside?" Vivian asked. He looked at her. "Going to find the access point," he said. She was quiet for just a second. Then she picked up her blazer from the back of the chair, which was still damp, and put it back on. "I'll come with you," she said. Chet. The western tie-down pad was a concrete apron about 60 by 80 feet, cracked in multiple places and heavily weathered, with 4 anchor rings still embedded in the surface at the corners. In the daytime it looked like what it was, an old pad where aircraft used to be secured overnight, nothing remarkable. In the dark, with one flashlight between them, it looked like a puzzle. Ethan walked the perimeter first, slowly, running the flashlight along the base where the concrete met the earth. Vivian walked the opposite edge. They didn't talk much. The rain had stopped completely by now, and the air was that clean, washed smell that comes after a summer storm, and somewhere distant a frog was making noise. "Here," Vivian said. He crossed to where she was standing. She was pointing her phone's light at a section of concrete near the northwest corner where the surface was slightly different, smoother or differently weathered, the seam between it and the surrounding pad almost invisible unless you were looking for it. Ethan crouched down. He ran his fingers along the seam. "That's a pour," he said. "Different date. Poured over something." He pressed on the surface. It didn't give, but something about the sound it made, slightly different, slightly hollow, told him what he needed to know. "There's a void under there." He stood up and looked at Vivian. She was looking at him with an expression he couldn't fully read in the dark. Something that might have been hope, but was keeping itself very controlled. "We're going to need some equipment," he said, "and I need to make a call." "Who are you calling?" "Somebody who knows how to do this without collapsing whatever's underneath." He was already pulling out his phone. "And somebody I actually trust." He looked at her. "Unlike everyone else in this situation right now." She didn't argue with that. "Fair enough," her expression said. "Fair enough." Ethan pressed the phone to his ear and listened to it ring in the dark, standing on a concrete pad that sat on top of 20 years' worth of buried evidence, with a woman he'd met 3 hours ago standing beside him, both of them soaking wet and running on coffee, and something that felt like it might be the beginning of a reason to believe that the truth had been waiting down there all along, patient and cold and preserved, waiting for someone to come and get it out. Marcus picked up on the third ring. "Do you know what time it is?" Marcus said. "Yeah," Ethan said. "Sorry, I need a favor." A pause. "Is this about the airport?" "Airfield." "I knew it," Marcus said. He sounded less annoyed now. He sounded, if anything, like a man who had been waiting for this exact phone call and had a thermos ready. "Tell me what you need." Marcus arrived at 6:40 in the morning, which was about 40 minutes after Ethan had expected him, and 20 minutes before Ethan had actually needed him, which was typical. He pulled up in his work truck, a battered F250 with a hydraulic lift mounted in the bed that he used for his machine shop work, and climbed out holding a large thermos and a paper bag from a diner in Ashford that Ethan recognized by the grease stains on the bottom. "Brought breakfast," Marcus said, looking at Vivian and her crew without visible surprise. He was 51, broad through the shoulders, with the kind of hands that made everything they touched look smaller. He'd served 2 tours and come back from the second one quieter than he'd left. He looked at Ethan. "You look terrible." "Didn't sleep." "I can see that." Marcus held out the paper bag. "Egg sandwiches, 3 of them. I didn't know you had company." "We can share," Vivian said. Marcus looked at her. "You're the one who landed the jet." "My pilot landed it." "On a dark runway in a storm." "He's very good," she said. Marcus considered this for a moment and then seemed to decide he'd reserve judgment. He set the bag on the hood of Ethan's pickup and started unloading the truck bed. He didn't ask for an explanation of the full situation yet. Ethan had given him the short version on the phone. Possible void under the western tie-down pad. Need to investigate without compromising structural integrity of whatever's below. And Marcus had shown up with the appropriate equipment, which was the thing about Marcus. He sorted out the why once the what was underway. Ethan divided the egg sandwiches while Marcus set up. Garrett, the pilot, ate his one-handed, his sprained wrist wrapped in the bandage from Ethan's kit. Suyan had gone back to the aircraft at first light to run a full post-weather inspection and reported back that the jet was mechanically sound, which meant it could leave whenever Vivian decided it was time. Vivian hadn't touched her sandwich yet. She was standing at the edge of the tie-down pad watching Marcus work, holding her coffee with both hands. "Your friend," she said quietly to Ethan. "Does he know what this might be about?" "He knows I worked in avionics before I retrained," Ethan said. "He doesn't know the specifics." "Are you going to tell him?" "When it's relevant." He looked at her. "He's not going to ask." "He's not curious?" "He's plenty curious. He just has manners about it." Marcus, without looking up from the ground-penetrating radar unit he was unfolding, said, "I can hear you both," in the tone of a man making a factual correction rather than a complaint. Ethan almost smiled. Then you know we're talking about you. I know you're deciding how much to tell me, Marcus said. He got the unit upright and ran a quick calibration check. You're going to tell me whatever you tell me, and then I'm going to do the job, same as it's always been. He looked at Vivian now, directly, with a steadiness that wasn't unfriendly but wasn't particularly soft either. I'm not asking for your whole story, but I need to know if what we're doing is legal, because I've got a business license I'd like to keep. Vivian nodded. The airfield is his property. What's beneath it is subject to some complicated questions, but we have documentation suggesting certain materials were stored here without the property owner's knowledge. That gives us reasonable standing to investigate. She paused. I have lawyers. If this goes somewhere, they'll clarify everything. Marcus looked at Ethan. She's not wrong, Ethan said. Your lawyers or company lawyers? Marcus asked Vivian. Something shifted in her expression, a tiny recalibration. Mine, she said. Personal counsel, not corporate. Marcus nodded once. All right. He pushed the radar unit onto the pad and started his first pass. Give me 20 minutes. The 20 minutes were quiet, in the way that the time before something significant is always quiet. Not peaceful, just held. The morning had come up clear after the storm, the kind of August morning that promises heat before 9 o'clock. The grass along the runway edges was still heavy with water and bent sideways from the night's wind. Ethan walked the perimeter of the pad again while Marcus ran his grid, not because he expected to see anything new, but because standing still right now wasn't something he could manage. He kept coming back to the letter. Your name is on the aircraft inside it. He'd turned that line over probably 50 times since he'd read it, and it still felt foreign, like information about someone else. He'd designed avionics systems for a program that he'd later been told never officially existed. His name had been on technical documents, on engineering logs. He'd never thought about what happened to those records after the program was dismantled. He'd been too busy trying to figure out how to feed a 3-year-old on a mechanic's wages to think about where the paper trail had gone. Apparently the paper trail had gone underground, literally. Okay, Marcus said. Ethan turned around. Marcus was standing at the northwest corner of the pad, looking at the readout screen on the radar unit. His face had gone careful in a way that Ethan recognized. Talk to me, Ethan said. There's a void, Marcus said. Significant one. Starts about 18 inches below grade, goes down. He studied the screen. Hard to say exactly. The return depth's unusual. Either the cavity is very deep or there's something in it that's interfering with the signal. He moved along the edge. The access point your person told you about, it's here. Or it was. There's a seam about 4 feet by 3 feet that was poured over, newer concrete on top. The void connects to what looks like a passage running. He turned, orienting himself, running northwest, toward the main hangar. Ethan looked toward the hangar. It was maybe 200 feet away. How far under the hangar does it go? Vivian asked. She'd come over quietly while Marcus was talking. Can't tell from here. I'd have to run a pass inside the hangar too. Marcus looked at Ethan. You got a jackhammer? I've got a rotary hammer and a cold chisel. That'll take a while. Then we better start. It took the better part of 3 hours. The poured-over concrete at the access point was thicker than it looked, 8 inches at least, dense aggregate, poured by someone who wanted it to stay closed. Ethan worked the rotary hammer while Marcus managed the edges with the cold chisel, and they took turns because the vibration and the noise combined into something that wore you down faster than either one alone. Vivian held the work light and didn't offer to help, which was the right call because there was nothing for a third person to do except be in the way, and she seemed to understand that. Around 10 in the morning, with the heat already serious and Ethan's shirt soaked through for the second time in 12 hours, the section came loose. Marcus caught it from underneath with a pry bar as Ethan worked the hammer into the final edge, and together they levered it up and slid it to the side, and underneath was dark and cool and smelled of dry air and something metallic that Ethan couldn't immediately identify. They all looked down. A steel ladder, bolted to the concrete walls of the shaft, descended into the dark. The rungs were dull, but not visibly rusted. The shaft was maybe 4 feet square, enough to descend one at a time, and at the bottom, Ethan aimed the flashlight down. A floor, level, and beyond it, a passage. "Huh," Marcus said. "Yeah," Ethan said. Vivian was looking down into the shaft with an expression that was very focused. "My father wasn't exaggerating," she said quietly, more to herself than to them. Ethan went first because it was his property and because waiting wasn't something he was going to do well right now. He tested each rung as he went, one at a time. They held. The shaft was maybe 15 feet deep, and at the bottom the passage extended ahead. Concrete walls, concrete floor, with a pair of fluorescent tubes mounted to the ceiling at intervals that had clearly been wired to a separate power system, now dead. He aimed his flashlight forward and got maybe 40 feet of visible passage before it bent right. Vivian came down behind him, then Marcus. Garrett had offered to come and been gently told to stay topside with his wrist. Su-Yan stayed too, on watch at the access point with instructions to call Ethan's cell if anything changed above ground, though cell service down here was going to be non-existent. They moved through the passage in single file, Ethan leading with the flashlight. The walls were bare concrete, poured smooth, nothing decorative about any of it. This had been built by engineers, not architects, and it showed. Utility over everything. Conduit runs along one wall, empty now, whatever cables had run through them long since stripped out or degraded. 3 doors in the left wall, all closed, all with lever handles. Ethan tried the first one, a storage room, metal shelving, empty. Second one, a mechanical space, an old air handler unit, silent. Third one opened into a larger room with a workbench running along one wall, and what might have been a server rack in the corner, empty. Someone had cleaned this place out. Not entirely, though. "Here," Marcus said from behind him. Ethan turned. Marcus had his own flashlight out and was pointing it at the floor of the main passage, about 20 feet past the third door. The passage widened there significantly, opened up from a corridor to something more like a room, and at the far end was a pair of large steel doors, the kind with a bar latch system across the center, closed and locked with a mechanism that looked like it had been built to last. Beside the door on the right, someone had bolted a small metal plate to the wall. The kind of thing you'd find in any industrial facility, a project designation or a facility code. Ethan aimed his light at it and read what was stamped into the metal. ASRG. Facility 7. Restricted Access. ASRG. Advanced Systems Research Group. He stood there for a moment with his flashlight on that plate and felt something move through him that wasn't quite any single emotion. Old anger and something raw, something he didn't have a name for yet. "A SRG," Vivian said from beside him. She was close enough that he could hear her breathing. "That's the division." "I know what it is," he said. She was quiet. Marcus looked at the door. "That lock's mechanical. Combination or key?" "Combination looks like," Ethan said. 5-digit dial." "You got any idea?" "No." He studied the mechanism. "But this was built in 2001, the letter said. Security protocol for this kind of lock in that era. There were standards. Maintenance override codes." He thought for a moment. "Most of the facilities I worked in that used this manufacturer's hardware had a factory override of either 77,200 or 44,400. I'm not guessing. It was a known issue." "Known to who?" Marcus asked. "To anybody who read the manufacturer's security bulletin from 1999, Ethan said. "Which apparently the people who built this did not, because they were in a hurry and this was meant to be temporary storage." He stepped up to the dial. "If I'm wrong, we're doing something else." He wasn't wrong. The second code, bit 44400, released the mechanism with a solid thunk that echoed in the corridor, and both Marcus and Vivian were quiet for a half second, in the way you're quiet when something works that you half expected not to. Ethan pulled the bar latch up, and the door swung outward on hinges that were dry but not seized. The smell came first. Not bad exactly, cool and dry, with a faint chemical undertone. Preservation compound, maybe, or just the specific smell of sealed air that hasn't moved in 20 years. Then the flashlight beam swept inside, and Ethan moved forward, and what he saw made him stop walking. The space was large. Not hangar large, but substantial, maybe 80 feet long and 40 wide, with a ceiling high enough to feel open, and in the center of it, draped partly by a tarp that had slid off the left side at some point and pooled on the floor, was an aircraft. Not intact. That was the first thing he processed. The fuselage was present, more or less complete, but the wings had been removed and were resting on cradles along the right wall. The tail assembly was intact. The cockpit section was there. It was a small aircraft. Single-engine turboprop configuration, unusual canard design that he recognized in a way that bypassed conscious memory and went straight to somewhere deeper. He'd seen this aircraft before. Not a production model. A prototype. He'd seen schematics of this airframe in a project file about 22 years ago, and he'd noted the canard design as elegant and said so to someone whose name he couldn't currently remember, in an office he couldn't exactly picture anymore, and the person had agreed with him. He walked toward it. "Ethan," Vivian's voice from somewhere behind him. He stopped. On the nose section of the fuselage, below the cockpit on the left side, was a small panel where the project team had apparently done what project teams sometimes do, signed their work. A small aluminum plate riveted to the skin. He aimed his light at it. 4 names, printed in small capitals. Chen, R. Halverson, M. Okafor, T. Mercer, E. His own name. Right there. On an aircraft in an underground room that the company had spent 20 years pretending didn't exist, as part of a project they'd spent 20 years pretending he hadn't contributed to. Marcus came and stood beside him and read the plate without saying anything. "That's your name," Marcus said after a moment. "Yeah. On this airplane." "Yeah." Marcus was quiet for a few seconds. Then, "How many of the other 3 are still around?" "Chen and Halverson. I don't know," Ethan said. "Okafor? Thomas Okafor died in 2009. Heart attack, I heard. He was 44. He paused. "He was also the one who filed the formal engineering escalation after mine didn't get traction. The one that was buried." Marcus absorbed this. "And nobody knew this plane was here." "Apparently not," Ethan said. "The company that stored it here was probably counting on the fact that they'd buried the program and nobody would come looking." He moved the flashlight along the fuselage. "They may not have even known what they were storing. If the executive who authorized this was keeping the program's existence for most of the company..." He stopped. The beam of his flashlight had caught something in the far back corner of the space that wasn't aircraft. It was a rack of storage canisters, the kind used for archived data and flight recording media. Sealed. Labeled in the same small capitals format as the nameplate. He walked toward it. Vivian was ahead of him, actually. She'd seen it at the same time and moved faster, and she was already crouched in front of the rack when he got there, running her flashlight along the labels. She reached the 3rd canister and stopped. "Ethan," she said. Her voice had changed. Not dramatically, just tighter. He came and looked over her shoulder at the label. CVR/FDR. Archive. N774-SR. Post-incident. Date: November 14th, 2003. N774-SR. He didn't need to look that up. The tail number was in a part of his memory that had never, in 20 years, gotten any quieter. It was the aircraft that had gone down, the one with 3 people in it, the one whose official accident record said pilot error, the flight data recorder, and the cockpit voice recorder. Both of them. Sitting in a rack in a sealed underground room, while above ground the official investigation had concluded there was nothing more to find. "They hit it," Vivian said, flatly. Not a question. "They hit it," Ethan confirmed. He was surprised, distantly, by how steady his own voice was. He'd spent a long time, years, honestly, trying not to think too directly about those 3 people, because if he thought about them directly, he had to think about what he'd filed and what had been done with what he'd filed, and that particular loop of thinking had nearly taken him apart in the year after the accident, and he'd learned to approach it sideways, carefully, the way you approach something hot that you have to touch anyway. He reached out and put his hand on the canister. "Can we get these out?" he asked Marcus. Marcus examined the rack, the weight of the canisters, the access point above. "We can get them out. It'll take some rigging. Not today if you want to do it without risking damage." He stood up and looked around the space, the aircraft, the wing cradles, the archived materials. Ethan, what you've got down here. This isn't just something you want to carry out in a backpack. You need to be thinking about documentation, chain of custody. The minute you move anything, somebody's going to question where it came from and whether it was tampered with. He's right, Vivian said. She'd stood up and was looking at the canister with an expression that had a complicated quality to it. She'd clearly been hoping for something like this and was now confronting what finding it actually meant. If this goes to federal investigators, and it will have to, the integrity of the evidence is everything. One question about how it was handled, and a defense attorney will spend a month making that question the whole story. So what do we do? Ethan asked. We document everything, she said. Down here, right now, exactly as it is. Video, photographs, written record, precise locations, exact condition, time stamps. She was already pulling out her phone, checking the battery. And then we need someone who can be present as an independent witness when we retrieve it. Someone with credentials who can testify to the chain of custody. I know somebody, Ethan said, the thought arriving even as he said it. Retired NTSB investigator. Moved down to Tifton a few years back. We've crossed paths a couple of times through the regional aviation community. He tried to remember the last time he'd seen her. A safety seminar in Valdosta, maybe 2 years ago. They'd talked for about an hour about accident investigation methodology, and she'd given him her card, and he'd kept it because she'd seemed like the kind of person whose card was worth keeping. Her name is Phyllis Odom. She's not cheap and she's not easy, but she knows exactly what proper evidence handling looks like, and nobody is going to question her record. Call her, Vivian said. I'll have to go up to get signal. Then go up. I'll stay here and start documenting. Marcus said he'd go up with Ethan to start thinking through the rigging logistics. As Ethan turned back toward the passage, he paused and looked at the aircraft one more time, the 4 names on the nose. His name, last alphabetically, riveted in aluminum on an airframe that was never supposed to exist, in a room that was never supposed to be found. He thought about Thomas Okafor, who had filed the escalation that went nowhere and died at 44. He thought about Chen and Halverson, wherever they were, who might not even know that a record of their work still existed underground in rural Georgia. He thought about 3 people in an aircraft designated N774-SR on a November morning in 2003. He went up the ladder into the morning heat. Phyllis Odom arrived the following afternoon, which was faster than Ethan had expected given that he'd reached her on a Tuesday and she was, by her own description on the phone, in the middle of something, which she did not elaborate on and which she apparently set aside without much ceremony. She was 63, short, with cropped gray hair, and the specific bearing of someone who has spent decades walking into situations where everyone is upset and nobody agrees on what happened. She drove a sensible sedan and carried a hard-sided case that turned out to contain documentation equipment, chain of custody materials, and a set of evidence-grade evidence bags that she apparently traveled with as a matter of habit. She looked at Ethan when she got out of the car and said, "You look like you haven't slept in 2 days." 1.5, he said. Close enough. She shook his hand. Show me what you've got. He showed her. She spent 45 minutes in the underground space without saying much, which he'd expected. Phyllis Odom had the investigator's quality of treating silence as a tool. She used it to observe, to think, and to let other people get uncomfortable enough that they said things they hadn't planned to. Ethan didn't get uncomfortable. He'd been around enough investigators to recognize the technique and just let it run. Vivian handled it less comfortably. Twice she started to explain something about the chain of ownership of the documents in the briefcase, and twice Phyllis raised one hand slightly without looking at her, and Vivian stopped. When Phyllis came back up from the underground space, she stood in the hangar for a moment in a shaft of afternoon sunlight coming through the skylight panels. She set her case down on the folding table, opened it, and began laying out her documentation materials. "The canisters," she said, "I know what those look like. I've seen that storage system before. The labeling protocol matches what the NTSB used for archived evidence from that period." She looked at Ethan. "If those recorders are inside there and they're what the label says they are, And if the chain of evidence from this facility to an NTSB lab can be established cleanly. She stopped. What exactly is your goal here? I need to hear it from you directly. The accident in November 2003 was attributed to pilot error, Ethan said. I believe the flight recorder data will show that there was a software failure in the flight control system, and that the decision to attribute it to pilot error was made to protect a company from liability and to conceal a defect that the company's engineering staff had flagged and been ignored on. He kept his voice level. I want the real cause on the record. I want the people who buried the investigation on record, and I want the defect identified so that if any version of that software is still in service, it can be found and fixed. Phyllis looked at him for a long moment. And the personal dimension, she said. Your career. That too, he said. But it's not the main thing? She seemed to measure whether that was true. All right, she said. I can certify the chain of custody for the evidence recovery if I'm present for the retrieval. I can contact colleagues at the NTSB and the FAA who I trust to handle a re-examination properly. She paused. This is going to take time. If there are people who want this buried and they find out what you're doing before you're ready, they have options. Legal options. Injunctions, court orders, arguments about property rights to what's on this land. I know, Ethan said. Do you have legal counsel? Not yet. She looked at Vivian. I have legal counsel, Vivian said, and I have resources to bring to this. Then use them, Phyllis said, because once word gets out that this exists, and it will, the window to do this correctly is short. She started photographing the evidence log she'd brought. We start the formal retrieval tomorrow morning. I need tonight to make some calls. She looked at Ethan again. Is there somewhere nearby I can get a decent meal and sleep tonight? Because I'm not staying in that trailer. There's a motel in Ashford, Ethan said. With functioning air conditioning? Probably. Good enough, Phyllis said, and snapped her case shut. That evening, after Phyllis had gone to Ashford and Marcus had gone home to his shop, and Garrett and Sue Yan had returned to the aircraft to handle some administrative filing, Ethan and Vivian sat in folding chairs outside the hangar as the light went down. He had a beer, his first in a few days. She had coffee, black, from the pot he'd brewed at 6 that morning and reheated twice since. When my father was running the company, Vivian said, after a while, I thought he was the most careful man in the world. I thought he thought about everything, every decision, every risk, every person it affected. She turned the mug in her hands. Finding out that the company did this while he was running it, that he didn't stop it, she stopped. The letter says he didn't know until later. I believe him. But I also know that sometimes you don't look too hard at things you don't want to find. Ethan thought about that. Yeah, he said finally. Does that make you angry at him? A little, he said honestly. But he's dead, and he spent his last 2 years trying to fix it, apparently. That's something. He looked out at the field. The runway lights were still off. They'd been on his list to repair before the storm had complicated everything, and now the list felt like it belonged to a different week. The people I'm angry at are the ones who are still around, the ones making decisions right now. Henderson, Vivian said. Raymond Henderson was the board member who had led the push to remove Robert Sterling from his CEO position and who had subsequently consolidated substantial control over Sterling Aerospace Systems. He's been trying to buy out my ownership stake for 4 months, since before my father died, actually. The lawyers he's sent... She stopped. He knows something is there. He may not know exactly what, but he's known there's risk somewhere. He's been trying to close off my access to anything related to that period for months. Then we don't have as long as Phyllis thinks we do, Ethan said. Probably not. He took a drink of his beer. How did you find out about this place? About the access point here specifically? My father kept a second set of files, she said. Not in the company system, not in his home office. He kept them with his personal attorney, sealed, with instructions that they went to me on his death and not before. The attorney held them for 12 years, apparently. She paused. Inside was a summary of everything he'd found out, and the name of the person who told him, a former project engineer who'd worked ASRG until the program was shut down. He'd tracked her down about 4 years before he died. Her name? Donna Kwan. She died 18 months ago. Cancer. Vivian said this quietly. She was the one who told my father about the flight recorders. She'd been there when they were moved. She hadn't been able to live with it, apparently, but she also hadn't known what to do with it. She'd spent years waiting for someone to come looking. And then she told your father. And then she died. And my father kept trying. And then he died. And now we're here. She looked at him with an expression that was very direct and a little tired. I know this is a lot to take on faith from someone you met in a storm 36 hours ago. It is, he agreed. Are you regretting it? He thought about the nameplate on the aircraft nose. Mercer, E. He thought about what it meant that his name was down there in the dark, preserved by accident in a place built to erase him. No, he said. She nodded, and they sat there in the fading light, two people who had arrived at the same broken open truth from opposite directions, and the field around them was quiet in the way that places are quiet when something important is about to happen, the specific stillness before. Ethan finished his beer. The night insects started up. Far out across the field, a single bat moved against the darkening sky in quick, efficient loops, hunting. Somewhere underground, in the dry, sealed dark, a flight recorder waited in its canister, with data on it. With the truth of a November morning in 2003, preserved in digital amber, patient as anything that has no other option but to wait. And in the morning, Phyllis Odom was going to make some calls. Phyllis made her calls that night from a motel room in Ashford, with the air conditioning turned up high enough that she had to put on a sweater, which was how she preferred to work. She'd been doing this long enough to know that the quality of a phone call at 11 at night was often better than the same call at 9 in the morning, because at 11, people were less guarded. They answered from their living rooms instead of their offices, and living rooms made people more honest. She reached two people. The first was a former colleague at the NTSB, who now ran an independent aviation forensics lab in Atlanta, a man named Birch, who had the specific reputation of being someone whose findings could not be bought, which was the rarest thing in any industry, but particularly rare in one where the stakes were regularly measured in billions of dollars. The second was a contact at the FAA's Flight Standards District office, a woman named Carver, who Phyllis had worked with on 3 previous re-examination cases and who had the institutional authority to initiate a formal review if presented with sufficient preliminary evidence. Neither of them told her she was crazy. Birch said, "Send me what you have," and Carver said, "I need to talk to my supervisor before I can commit to anything, but I'm listening," which, from Carver, was practically enthusiasm. Phyllis was back at Millhaven by 7 the next morning with 2 coffees from the gas station 6 miles east and the expression of someone who had slept 4 hours and considered it adequate. The formal retrieval took most of that day. Phyllis documented everything: the access point, the passage, the facility door with its ASRG designation, the interior space with the disassembled aircraft, the storage rack. She photographed the canister labels, the nameplate on the aircraft nose, the empty rooms that had been cleaned out, the manufacturer's marks on the storage system. She created a written log with timestamps for every observation and every action, and she had both Ethan and Marcus sign it as secondary witnesses at each stage. When they lifted the canisters, 4 of them, 2 marked CVR and 2 marked FDR, for the incident date in November 2003, she sealed each one in an evidence bag immediately after photographing it in place, and she logged the seal numbers. She moved with the unhurried precision of someone who had seen cases get destroyed by sloppy handling and had made a personal commitment to never let that happen on her watch. Ethan carried the canisters up the ladder one at a time. It was physical work in the August heat, and he was sweating through his shirt by the 3rd trip, but he didn't ask Marcus to do it. It felt like his job. He didn't fully understand why it felt that way, but it did, and he went with it. By 4 in the afternoon, the canisters were sealed and logged and locked in the hard case that Phyllis had brought, and Birch from the Atlanta Forensics Lab was scheduled to arrive the following morning. Ethan sat on the ground outside the hangar with his back against the wall and drank water and tried to feel something specific about what they'd just done, but couldn't land on anything single. It was too large. It kept slipping out from under whatever feeling he reached for. Cora called it 6, right on schedule. "Hey," she said, "you sound weird." "I'm tired." "Different weird than tired." A pause. "What's going on?" He thought about how to answer that. Cora was 19 and studying the same field he'd been erased from, and she knew more about his history in the industry than he'd ever explicitly told her. She'd pieced it together over years from half conversations and old documents she'd found in boxes when she was maybe 15 and had never directly asked him about, but clearly hadn't forgotten. She was not a person you could give a partial answer to and have it go unnoticed. Some things have come up with the Airfield, he said. Related to why I bought it, maybe. I don't know yet. Related how? The kind of related where I'd rather tell you in person. Another pause, longer. Daddy, are you in trouble? He hadn't been called that since she was about 12, and it landed somewhere in his chest that he hadn't expected. No, he said. I'm not in trouble. I'm the opposite of trouble right now. He hesitated. Can you come down this weekend? I know you've got... I'll come Friday, she said. I'll shift my study group. You don't have to shift. I'll come Friday, she said again, firmly, in the tone of voice that was somehow exactly her mother's, even though she'd been raised mostly by him, and he'd never been able to figure out where it came from. I'll see you Friday. Get some sleep before then. I'll try. Ethan, she said, which was what she called him when she was being serious and not his kid. Whatever it is, you've got it, okay? You always have. He sat with the phone after she hung up and listened to the field settle into evening quiet, and something tight in his chest loosened a fraction. Not all the way, but enough to breathe against. Birch arrived the following morning in a van with climate-controlled storage compartments, and the manner of a man who had driven 4 hours and was fine with it. He was 50-ish, angular, with reading glasses pushed up onto his forehead and a handshake that was brief and serious. He looked at Phyllis's documentation, asked 3 very specific questions about the chain of custody, and then said he was ready to begin the preliminary examination of the canisters to determine whether the recording media inside was intact and readable. He set up in the hangar, and Ethan watched from across the room, and Vivian watched from beside Ethan, and nobody said much for 2 hours. What Birch determined at the end of those 2 hours was this. The canisters were intact. The media inside was a solid-state recording format that had been used extensively in that period, and that his lab had full capability to read. There were no visible signs of tampering with the seals, which matched the sealing protocol used by the NTSB Evidence Archive Division in 2003. He couldn't tell them yet what the data said, that required lab analysis and a proper readout protocol, but he could tell them that there was a very high probability the data was there. If these recorders were sealed the way the documentation suggests, shortly after the incident, Birch said, the data preservation in this storage environment should be excellent. Cool, dry, stable temperature. Better conditions than a lot of official archives, honestly. He looked at Ethan. I need to take these to the lab. I can have preliminary findings within 72 hours. How confident are you? Vivian asked. Birch looked at her over his reading glasses in the way of someone who has been asked that question many times and has a consistent answer for it. I don't do confident, he said. I do thorough. Come back to me in 72 hours. He left with the canisters and Phyllis's documentation, and the hangar felt emptier after he was gone, and the next 3 days were the hardest kind of waiting, the kind with nothing to do but think. Ethan worked on the runway lights. He had a project, and the project didn't stop needing attention just because the ground had cracked open beneath it, and working with his hands kept the thinking from becoming a loop. He replaced corroded connections on the east end, tested circuits, started drawing up the materials list for the approach light system he wanted to install eventually. Normal work, the kind where you could see progress at the end of the day and measure it in feet of working wiring. Vivian stayed. He hadn't expected that. He'd half expected her to go back to New York or wherever she was based and wait remotely, the way people who had assistants and corporate jets waited for things. But she was still there the second morning, and the third, working from her phone and her laptop at the folding table in the hangar, taking calls in the parking area where the signal was better, occasionally bringing him coffee when she was getting some for herself. She wasn't there to babysit the situation. He could see that after a day or two. She was there because she didn't have anywhere she'd rather be, and that surprised him in a way he kept privately to himself. On the second evening, she told him more about Raymond Henderson, and as she talked, the shape of what they were actually dealing with became clearer and more uncomfortable. Henderson had been on the Sterling Aerospace Board since 2007, brought in as an outside director with a private equity background. He'd positioned himself as a financial modernizer, which was the kind of language boards loved, and which in practice had meant a series of divestitures that sold off most of the original research and development capacity in favor of defense contract revenue that came with lower margins but more predictable cash flow. The board had found this reasonable. Robert Sterling had found it catastrophic and said so, and Henderson had used that disagreement, professionally, carefully, over about 3 years, to build enough support to remove Sterling from the CEO role. He didn't do anything obviously illegal, Vivian said. He was very careful about that. Everything was proper board procedure. Everything was documented correctly. She was sitting across the table from Ethan, and the way she said this made it clear how much she hated that it was true. But what my father believed, and what I believe now, looking at the timeline, is that Henderson knew about the ASRG situation. Not every detail. But he knew there was liability exposure, and part of why he wanted my father out was to make sure my father never started pulling that thread. How long has he known? My father thought probably 2010, 2011. Someone on the board at that time had access to some of the original records and apparently mentioned it to Henderson. She paused. And then that board member died in 2013 and those records disappeared from the system. Convenient, Ethan said. Very. He looked at her. Does Henderson know you're here? Not here specifically, but he knows I've been investigating. He's known that since March. She set her coffee down. 2 weeks ago, one of his lawyers contacted me about a quote-unquote comprehensive estate settlement that would give me full liquidity on my stake in the company, essentially buying me out, in exchange for a non-disclosure agreement covering my father's personal papers and communications. She said this evenly, but her jaw had tightened. The number was significant. It was a number designed to be hard to say no to. And? I said no. She looked at him. He'll try again, and the next offer will be different. Less money, more lawyers. Ethan sat back. When the recorder data comes back, if it shows what we think it shows. What's the path? Walk me through it. Birch's findings go to Carver at the FAA and to the NTSB formally. At that point, it becomes a federal matter, and it's out of Henderson's reach legally. He can't suppress a federal investigation. She was thinking through it as she spoke, the way she thought, clearly and in sequence. But there's a window between when the findings come back and when the federal process formally begins where he can move. Court orders, injunctions against releasing information publicly. If he gets a judge to freeze the process while his lawyers argue about evidence provenance, he could delay it indefinitely, Ethan said. Long enough to call a board vote that finalizes his control of the company, she said. There's a board meeting scheduled in 6 weeks. He has enough proxies lined up to push through a governance restructuring that would make it almost impossible to challenge his decisions afterward. She looked at him. If we get our evidence into the federal process before that vote, we can expose what he's been protecting, and that changes the board dynamics entirely. If we don't, she left the rest of it unfinished. Ethan was quiet for a moment. I want to talk to my daughter before anything else happens publicly, he said. She needs to hear this from me. Vivian nodded immediately. Of course. And I want to look at the documents in your briefcase, he said. All of them, not summaries. The actual documents. I'll get them. She opened the briefcase on the table and they spent the rest of the evening going through it, side by side. And what was in there was more than he'd imagined and worse than he'd hoped. And the kind of thing that, once you've read it, you can't stop having read. Internal memos from 2003 discussing the scope of the engineering objections and using language like manage the narrative and limit disclosure perimeter. Correspondence between the executive who'd run ASRG, a man named Gerald Pratt, who had retired in 2008 and died in 2017, and the head of the legal department discussing what the letter called contingency protocols in the event of a negative safety event. A negative safety event. 3 people in an aircraft. And an email from October 2003, 1 month before the accident, from a mid-level project manager whose name Ethan didn't recognize, to Pratt. Engineering has flagged the edge case scenario again. Mercer's original analysis was apparently more robust than we gave it credit for. Recommend we revisit before the next evaluation flight. Pratt's response, 3 hours later, 4 words. Stay the course. GP. Ethan read that email 3 times. Then he closed the folder and put it face down on the table and stared at the wall of the hangar for a while. Vivian didn't say anything. She gave him the silence and didn't try to fill it, which was exactly right and which he noticed without being able to say so. Okay, he said finally. Okay, she agreed. Birch called at 9 in the morning on the 3rd day, which was faster than 72 hours, and which Ethan took as a sign of either very good news or very bad news. And he was holding the phone so hard that Marcus, who was standing nearby pretending to inventory a tool chest, looked over at him with an expression of careful attention. The data is intact, Birch said, both recorders. FDR gives us a complete flight parameter record from takeoff to impact. CVR has full audio from the last 2 hours of the flight, which covers the entirety of what matters. A pause. I've done a preliminary read. I'm not going to give you a formal finding over the phone. That goes through proper channels in writing. But I'll tell you this. What's on these recordings does not support a pilot error determination. Not even close. Another pause. I want to be careful here, but I'll say, the control surface behavior in the final 4 minutes of that flight is consistent with a software-driven feedback event. The crew response was appropriate and timely. They didn't get the 4 seconds they needed. Ethan was standing outside the hangar in the morning sun, and he didn't move for a few seconds after Birch finished talking. Thank you, he said. Phyllis will be the one filing the formal report request, Birch said. I'll have my written preliminary to her by end of day. After that, the FAA and NTSB process kicks in, and it moves at its own speed. A brief pause. For what it's worth, Yabab, I've been doing this a long time. What's in here is real. It's not ambiguous. Ethan walked back into the hangar. Vivian looked up from her laptop the moment she saw his face. It's there, he said. The data's there. It shows what we thought it shows. She closed the laptop. She didn't say anything for a second. Something moved across her face that he couldn't quite read. Not triumph, not even relief. Something quieter than that. The face of someone who has been carrying a possibility for a long time and has finally been told it was real. My father was right, she said. Yeah, Ethan said. He was right. Marcus set down the tool he wasn't really using and turned around. So what happens now? Now Phyllis files the formal request and Birch's findings go to the FAA, Ethan said. And then, his phone buzzed. He looked at it. Unknown number, Georgia area code. He almost didn't answer it, and then he did. Mr. Mercer? The voice was measured, professional, the voice of someone who made uncomfortable calls for a living. My name is David Lester. I'm legal counsel representing Raymond Henderson and several members of the Sterling Aerospace Systems Board of Directors. I'd like to speak with you about some matters related to your property at Millhaven Airfield. Ethan looked at Vivian. She'd heard enough of it from across the table. Her expression had gone very still. How did you get this number? Ethan said. Property records are public, Mr. Mercer. Your contact information is associated with your business registration. A pause. I'd like this to be a friendly conversation. My clients are aware that you may have encountered some materials on your property that are the subject of ongoing corporate record questions, and they'd like to discuss the situation before... Before what? Ethan said. A brief pause. Recalculation. Before this becomes more complicated for everyone. It's already complicated, Ethan said, but I appreciate the call. I'm going to pass your information to my attorney. Mr. Mercer, I don't think you fully understand. I understand fine, Ethan said. Have a good day, Mr. Lester. He hung up. The hangar was quiet. That was fast, Marcus said. They've been watching her, Ethan said, looking at Vivian. Or watching this property. Or both. Vivian was already on her phone. I'm calling my personal counsel now. She was standing, moving toward the door for signal. They found you faster than I expected. We need to accelerate the filing. Is there a way to do that? She paused at the door and looked back at him. If Phyllis can get the preliminary request to Carver today, It starts the federal clock. Once that clock is running, Henderson's lawyers can file all the injunctions they want. They're working against a federal process at that point, and that's a much harder fight. She pushed through the door, already talking into the phone. Ethan stood in the middle of the hangar with Marcus. "You okay?" Marcus asked. "Not especially," Ethan said. "Want some coffee?" "Yeah." Marcus went to the coffee maker. Ethan stood there and thought about the lawyer's voice on the phone, that measured professional tone designed to sound reasonable while implying that unreasonableness had consequences. He'd heard that tone before. Different person, same register, 20 years ago, a different lawyer, a conversation about his termination that had been phrased with exactly that kind of careful friendliness that meant the opposite of friendly. He thought about what came next and didn't make himself think it was going to be easy, because it wasn't. Henderson's team had resources and they had time. The board vote was in 6 weeks, and 6 weeks was enough time to bury things if you had the right tools. Phyllis called an hour later. She'd spoken to Carver, and Carver had spoken to her supervisor, and the formal preliminary inquiry request was going in that afternoon. It didn't mean the investigation was open. It meant the door was open, and once it was open, closing it required a level of interference that became its own liability. "We're in the process," Phyllis said. "That's the best we can do right now." "That's enough," Ethan said, "for now." What he didn't tell Phyllis, what he hadn't told anyone yet, was that Lester Calling had sharpened something in him that had been building since the moment he'd read that forward email from Gerald Pratt. Stay the course. He'd spent 20 years being on the wrong end of decisions made by men like Henderson, men like Pratt, men whose entire strategy was to exhaust the opposition and wait for them to run out of money or patience or will. He wasn't going to run out of will. That was the thing they were going to find out. Cora arrived Friday evening in a second-hand Civic with a broken passenger side mirror and a backpack full of textbooks she said she'd study over the weekend, which both of them knew wasn't going to happen. She pulled into the gravel parking area next to the hangar and got out and looked around at the airfield with the particular look she'd always had when confronted with something new. Half assessment, half hunger. "It's bigger than I thought," she said. "It's a lot to work on," he agreed. She looked at him. She was 19, but had always looked at him like someone older, with that steady, measuring gaze that saw through the things he didn't say. "You look better than you sounded on the phone," she said, "like something's been resolved." "Something has, and something else is starting." She picked up her backpack. "Then show me." He showed her. He took her down into the underground space, which she walked through in silence, running her fingers along the wall of the passage, stopping in front of the aircraft the way he had stopped in front of it, not overwhelmed, just absorbing. When she reached the nose and read the nameplate, she stood there for a long time without moving. "Mercer E?" she said. "Yeah." She turned to look at him. Something in her face was working hard at staying composed and mostly succeeding. "How long has this been down here?" 20 years, give or take. She nodded slowly. "And those other names, Chen, Halverson, do you know where they are?" "Working on finding out." "We should find them," she said. "If this gets public, they deserve to know what's happening." He looked at her. At 19, she was already thinking about the other people, the ones whose names were on the plate beside his. He thought, "You raised her right. You managed to do that one thing right even when everything else was falling apart." "Yeah," he said. "We will." They came back up into the late evening air, and Cora met Vivian, and Ethan watched that first moment with more attention than he let show. Cora was not suspicious by nature, but she was discerning, and she shook Vivian's hand and looked at her in a way that lasted just a half-second too long to be entirely casual. Later, when Vivian had gone to check on Garrett and the aircraft, Cora found him at the coffee maker in the hangar and said, without preamble, "She's not what I expected." "What did you expect?" Cora thought about it. "Somebody who wants something different than what you want." "She might," Ethan said. "We haven't disagreed yet." "Yet," Cora said, with the emphasis of someone filing a note. "Yet," he agreed. He poured 2 cups and gave her one, and they stood in the hangar together, his daughter who was studying the field he'd been driven out of, and out on the cracked asphalt. The evening light was going gold and the grass along the runway edges was still and everything was quiet. In the way that things are quiet right before they are no longer quiet at all. His phone buzzed again. Different unknown number, this time a Virginia area code. He looked at it, then at Cora. "You should answer it," she said. He answered it. The voice on the other end was not a lawyer. It was a man who identified himself as a senior investigator from the FAA's Office of Audit and Evaluation, who said that he'd been briefed by his colleague Carver on the preliminary inquiry, and that based on what Carver had told him, he wanted to have a conversation directly with Ethan before end of business today. "I've got some time," Ethan said. And outside, 300 miles north in Atlanta, Birch was sealing his written preliminary findings in an envelope that would go out courier delivery first thing tomorrow morning. And in Ashford, Phyllis was drafting the formal chain of custody documentation that would accompany it. And in the offices of a downtown Manhattan law firm, David Lester was reporting back to Raymond Henderson that Ethan Mercer had declined to engage and had mentioned an attorney, and Henderson had sat with that information for a moment, and then said something quiet to the man beside him that Lester hadn't quite caught. And at Millhaven Airfield, in the early Georgia dark, Ethan Mercer stood in a hangar he'd bought on instinct and talked to a federal investigator about a November morning in 2003. And for the first time in 20 years, his voice on the subject was not a warning that nobody was listening to. It was evidence. The FAA investigator's name was Warren Tillis, and he had the kind of voice that gave nothing away. Not skeptical, not convinced, just methodically receptive. The way a very good poker player looks when they're holding something significant and don't want you to know it yet. He asked Ethan to walk him through the timeline of finding the underground facility, the chain of custody procedures Phyllis had followed, and Birch's preliminary findings. He asked clarifying questions that were precise enough to tell Ethan he'd already read everything Carver had sent him. He didn't editorialize. He didn't say anything encouraging. He said, at the end of 40 minutes, that he would be in contact within 48 hours, and he said it in a tone that suggested 48 hours meant 48 hours and not a day longer. Ethan hung up and stood in the hangar and felt the specific hollowness of having done everything you can do for now and having to wait for the world to catch up. Cora was sitting on the rolling stool eating the sandwich she'd brought from the gas station, watching him. "Well," she said, "he'll call back in 2 days." "That's it?" "That's it for tonight." She chewed, thinking. "He believed you." "How do you know?" "Because he didn't ask you to send him anything in writing before he'd engage," she said. "If he thought you were a crank, he'd have given you an email address and ended the call in 10 minutes. She finished the sandwich. "He believed you. He's just being careful about it." Ethan looked at his daughter, at the easy competence with which she'd read a situation she hadn't been present for, and felt the particular mix of pride and something adjacent to grief that had followed him since she was small. Pride that she was this person, and the grief was for her mother, who wasn't here to see it, and for the years when Cora had been growing into exactly this, and he'd been too exhausted and too buried to notice every moment of it the way he should have. "Yeah," he said. "I think you're right." The next 2 days were a compressed version of the waiting they'd been doing all week, but louder. David Lester called again on Saturday morning, and this time left a voicemail when Ethan didn't pick up, a carefully worded message that used the phrase significant financial consideration twice, and the phrase mutually beneficial resolution once, and that Ethan forwarded to Vivian's personal attorney, a woman named Grace Park, who had taken the case with the crisp efficiency of someone who had been waiting for exactly this kind of work to come through her door. Grace Park called Ethan directly that afternoon. She had a voice like a scalpel, precise, not unkind, but designed to cut cleanly. "They're scared," she said. "That's what Lester's calls mean. If they were confident in their legal position, they wouldn't be calling. They'd be filing." "They might still file," Ethan said. "They will," she said, "but it'll be reactive. They'll wait to see what the FAA does and then file against that, which means we're ahead of them right now, and we need to stay ahead." A pause. "I'm going to reach out to Lester and tell him my client is not available for settlement discussions, and that any further contact should be directed to me. That buys us some quiet." Another pause. "And it tells them that Vivian has engaged personal counsel, which tells them she's serious, which may make them accelerate. Or make them more aggressive, Ethan said. Probably both, Grace said. Welcome to it. On Sunday evening, two men Ethan didn't recognize drove slowly past the airfield entrance twice. He noticed them on the second pass because the car was the same, a dark blue sedan, no plates visible from his angle, and it slowed noticeably each time it reached the gate. He wrote down what he could see and texted it to Grace and to Phyllis, and Phyllis called back within 10 minutes and said, "Don't engage with anyone you don't know. If they come on the property, call the sheriff's office first, me second." "You think they'd do something?" he asked. "I think they'd do nothing violent and several things legal that would complicate our timeline," Phyllis said. "Serving you with papers, photographing the property, documenting what's visible. Any of those things could be used in a motion to challenge the evidence collection." She paused. "Lock the access point. Concrete cap back over it if you can manage it." He and Marcus spent 2 hours that evening resetting the concrete section they'd removed over the access shaft, packing it with quick-set compound to reseal it. It wasn't as solid as it had been. That concrete had been poured properly by someone with equipment, and they were doing it with a bucket and a hand trowel, but it looked closed, and looking closed was the point. Tillis called back Monday morning. 46 hours, not 48. Ethan was outside by the runway, checking a junction he'd left partially open on Thursday when everything else had started, and he had to sit down on the ground next to the junction box to take the call because his knees went slightly unreliable the moment he saw the Virginia area code. "We've reviewed Birch's preliminary findings and Odom's chain of custody documentation," Tillis said. "The FAA is opening a formal special investigation under the Aviation Safety Program. That means federal jurisdiction attaches to the evidence immediately." Ethan closed his eyes. "Mr. Mercer, you with me?" "Yeah," Ethan said. "Yeah, I'm here." "The NTSB has been notified. They'll be opening their own parallel process. That's standard when there's a potential re-examination of a closed accident determination." Tillis paused. "I want to be clear with you about what this means and what it doesn't mean. It means the evidence is protected and the process is underway. It does not mean the original accident determination has been overturned. That's a separate finding that takes time. It does not mean any criminal referral has been made. That's the DOJ's territory, and we don't make that determination." Another pause. "What it does mean is that anyone attempting to interfere with this investigation from here forward is looking at federal obstruction charges. I want you to know that because I suspect you're going to have visitors soon who are going to try to pressure you." "I've already had calls," Ethan said. "I know, Carver told me." A brief pause that might have been something almost like dryness. "Don't pick up." Ethan called Vivian immediately after, and she was already on the phone with Grace when his call came through, so he got a text back in under 2 minutes. "I know, Grace just told me. Hold tight." And then, 30 seconds later, a second text. "Good work, Ethan." He sat on the ground next to the open junction box and let the morning sun work on him for a while. The field was quiet. A hawk was doing slow circles above the north end of the runway, working a thermal, and the tall grass was moving in the same light wind that had been coming off the low ridge to the east since about 6 in the morning. It was, objectively, a good morning. One of the better mornings he'd had in a long time. He let himself feel that for a few minutes before he got back to work. What came after that was not a clean, straight road. He'd known it wouldn't be, and knowing it didn't make the parts of it any easier when they arrived. Henderson's attorneys filed in federal court that Wednesday, a motion challenging the evidence collection procedure at Millhaven on grounds that Sterling Aerospace Systems retained legal claim to materials stored on the property prior to Ethan's purchase, and that the removal of said materials without notice to the corporation constituted improper seizure. Grace filed a response that was, by her own description when she called Ethan about it, fairly aggressive. The judge assigned to the motion had it on her docket for the following Monday. On Thursday, a story appeared on a financial news website under the headline, "Sterling Aerospace Rocked by Disputed Evidence Claim from Georgia Landowner." The story described Ethan as a former contract worker with a history of unsubstantiated complaints, and described the investigation as based on materials of uncertain provenance recovered from an abandoned property. It quoted an unnamed source close to the Sterling Aerospace Board describing Ethan's actions as a coordinated attempt to extract financial settlement by threatening reputational damage. Cora texted him the link with a single-word message. "Seriously?" He called her back. "Don't respond to it online, he said, before she could say anything. "I know that," she said. "I'm not 12. A pause. "They called you a contract worker. You weren't a contract worker." "I know." "You had patents." "I know. 2 of them." "Cora, they're lying about who you are and it's out there and people are reading it." He sat with that for a second. "Yeah," he said. "That's the play. Make me look small before the facts come out. If they can get the narrative established before the federal process produces anything public, then when the findings come out, people already have a frame for it." "That's awful," she said. "It's effective," he said, "which is different." He paused. "I need you to not look at the comments section." Silence. "Cora?" "I only read about 30 of them," she said. "That's 30 too many." "Some people agree with us," she said, slightly defensive. "Some people agree with us on a financial news website, which means they're in a niche that already exists," he said. "That's not the audience that matters. The audience that matters is the board of directors, the federal investigators, and eventually a judge. Focus on those." She was quiet for a moment. "You're good at this," she said. "The strategy part. I didn't know that about you." "I've had 20 years to think about what I'd do if I ever had the chance," he said, and immediately felt the weight of that sentence after it left his mouth. She felt it too. "I know," she said quietly. "I know, Daddy." The article was followed over the next few days by 2 more pieces on different outlets, one trade publication, one broader business news site that carried similar framing, unnamed sources, questions about Ethan's credibility. A mention of the settlement offers he'd declined, framed as his having refused reasonable accommodations, which was a way of making reasonableness look like it was on the other side. Grace told him to expect this and not respond publicly. "Every statement you make right now becomes material for their lawyers," she said. "Silence is correct. Let the process speak." "What about Vivian?" he said. "Vivian is not responding publicly either," Grace said, which is its own statement. If she were on Henderson's side, she'd be quoted in these articles. Her silence tells anyone paying attention that she isn't. Marcus came by on Friday and read the articles on his phone while sitting on the tailgate of his truck, and then put the phone away and didn't mention them. That was Marcus. He asked Ethan if there was anything useful he could do on the runway light project, and Ethan said yes, and they spent the afternoon working side by side on the East End connection boxes, and the subject of financial news websites did not come up again. The court hearing on Monday was not dramatic. Ethan attended with Grace, who had the bearing of someone who found courtrooms comfortable in the way that carpenters find lumber comfortable, native environment, familiar materials. The judge, a woman named Evers, who had clearly read every filing and had questions for both sides that suggested she'd also done outside research, asked Henderson's attorneys to explain the basis for the corporation's claim to materials on a property it had sold in a tax foreclosure 11 years prior. The attorneys had an answer. They always had an answer. But it was the kind of answer that required several subordinate arguments to hold up the main one, and Judge Evers had a way of listening to subordinate arguments that made them feel what they were. She didn't rule from the bench. She said she'd have a written decision within 5 business days. Grace said, in the parking lot, she's going to deny the motion. "You're sure?" Ethan said. 85% sure, Grace said, which in legal terms is as close to sure as I get. She straightened her jacket. "Henderson's team knows it too. They filed that motion to slow us down, not to win it. They bought themselves a week and a half." She looked at him. "What they're actually doing in that week and a half is working the board, consolidating votes for the governance restructuring." She paused. "Which means we need to think about what happens at the board meeting. That's the actual fight." This was the conversation that changed the shape of everything that followed. Ethan and Vivian and Grace sat in the hangar that evening. Cora had gone back to Atlanta for the week, reluctantly, with a promise to return Friday, and they talked through it. The board meeting was in 4 weeks now. Henderson had been working his proxy campaign for months, and by Grace's estimate had enough votes to push through the governance restructuring that would consolidate his control, unless enough of the current board members changed their positions. Changing their positions required them to see something that made Henderson's position untenable. The federal investigation was real, but it moved slowly, and formal findings were unlikely before the board meeting, which meant the evidence needed to come to the board, not wait for the board to hear about it through official channels. "You're talking about presenting at the meeting," Ethan said. "I'm talking about requesting the right to present," Vivian said. "As a major shareholder, I can request floor time at a board meeting. They can't legally deny it if I make the request properly and give sufficient notice." She looked at Grace. "Can they block it?" "They can try to limit the time," Grace said. "They can have their lawyers object to specific materials, but they cannot deny you the floor entirely without creating significant legal exposure." She looked at Ethan. "If Vivian presents and you're there as her technical witness, with Birch's preliminary findings, with the internal documents, with Phyllis's chain of custody record, in front of the board members and whatever investors attend that meeting, we put it in the room," Ethan said, "where they can't ignore it and can't claim they didn't know. And every board member who votes for the restructuring after that is on record having voted with full knowledge of the evidence against the company," Grace said. "That's a very different legal position for them to be in." Vivian was looking at Ethan. "It has to be you presenting the technical side," she said, "not Birch, not Phyllis. You. Because you're the engineer who flagged it, and you're the person this was done to, and there is no version of that presentation that lands the same way without you standing there." She paused. "I know that's a lot to ask." Ethan thought about standing in front of a room full of corporate board members and investors and presenting the evidence of his own erasure. He thought about the email. "Stay the course, GP." He thought about what Tillis had said on the phone. "I suspect you're going to have visitors soon who are going to try to pressure you." He thought about the articles online and the word unsubstantiated and what it meant to have your reality publicly described as unsubstantiated. "I'll do it," he said. "You don't have to decide tonight," Vivian said. "I already decided," he said. "I'm just saying it out loud now." The next 3 weeks were the most complicated of his life in a specific way that had nothing to do with dramatic confrontation and everything to do with sustained pressure. Henderson's attorneys filed 2 more motions, both denied, one quickly, one after a 3-day consideration by Judge Evers, who ultimately came down the same way she had the first time. A second wave of media coverage hit, slightly more prominent than the first, and this time included a piece that mentioned Ethan by name in the headline, which meant that when Cora did a search for his name, which he'd told her not to do, and which she did anyway, it was the first result. She called him about it at 11 at night. "There's a quote from someone who says they worked with you, who says you had a reputation for being difficult to manage," she said. Her voice was controlled but had an edge under it that he recognized. She was angry and trying to sound analytical about it. "I don't know who that is," he said. "It's anonymous." "Then it's either fabricated or it's someone who was told what to say." He paused. "Cora, I need you to let this go tonight. It's 11 o'clock and you have a fluid mechanics exam on Thursday." "I know I have a fluid mechanics exam." "Then go study fluid mechanics." A pause. "Are you okay?" The question was simple, and he chose to answer it simply. "I'm tired," he said. "I'm frustrated. I believe in what we're doing. That's where I am." "That's enough," she said. "Right?" "Yeah," he said. "That's enough." It was mostly. There were hours, usually between 2 and 4 in the morning, which is the hour when everything looks its worst, when he sat in the travel trailer with the lights on and the Georgia dark outside the windows, and went through the sequence of what could still go wrong. Grace filed a challenge to the board meeting format that was partially granted and partially denied, which meant Vivian would get floor time, but with a 30-minute limit, which was tight but workable. Birch's preliminary findings were officially incorporated into the federal investigation record, which meant they were protected and citable, but also meant that nothing further would be made public until the investigation concluded, which could be months. Phyllis confirmed that the NTSB had assigned a re-examination team but couldn't give a timeline. What they had for the board meeting was the internal documents from Robert Sterling's files. Birch's preliminary findings, which were on record and could be described, the chain of custody documentation for the recovered recorders, and Ethan himself, his original engineering reports, his performance history before the erasure, his patents, his conference presentations, everything that demonstrated who he had been before they tried to make him into someone who hadn't existed. Grace helped him build the presentation. It was not her specialty, but she had the lawyer's instinct for what a room needed to hear and in what order, and together they organized it in the sequence that moved from facts to impact to implication. Technical evidence first, human cost second, current risk third. The board members who were still persuadable, and Grace estimated there were 3 or 4 of them, needed to hear the evidence before they heard the story, because if they heard the story first, they'd protect themselves by deciding the evidence was questionable. Cora came down the Friday before the board meeting and sat with him while he practiced the presentation in the hangar, walking it through out loud in front of Marcus and Vivian and Phyllis, who had come down for the day to go over her chain of custody testimony. Marcus sat on a folding chair and watched with his arms crossed, and didn't say anything until Ethan was finished, and then said, "The 4th section, where you go through the emails. You're rushing it." "I know," Ethan said. "I rush it because I hate those emails." "That's why you can't rush it," Marcus said. "The stuff you hate is the stuff they need to sit with." Ethan stood at the front of the hangar with the laptop and the small projector he'd borrowed from the county library, and looked at the 4 people sitting in folding chairs in front of him, and took a breath. "The 4th section," he said, and started again, slower. Cora watched the whole thing without expression, which was how she watched things she was paying close attention to. When it was done, she waited until Marcus and Phyllis had given their notes, and then she came over to him. "One thing," she said, "tell me. At the end, when you talk about what the academy is going to be, you say it almost like an apology, like you're aware it might sound like a personal interest thing, and you're trying to get ahead of that." She looked at him steadily. "Don't apologize for it. It's not a conflict of interest to want to build something good. Say it like it's true, because it is true." He thought about that. "Okay." "Say it like it matters," she said, "because it does." He nodded. He looked at her. "When did you get so good at this?" She considered that seriously. "I think I learned it from watching you not be good at it," she said, "which is the kindest thing I can say." He laughed. A real one, shorter than he expected, surprised out of him. It felt like something unclenching. The board meeting was in Atlanta, in the Sterling Aerospace Systems corporate headquarters on the 34th floor of a building that had views of the city in 3 directions and the kind of conference room that was designed to communicate power through its furniture. Ethan arrived with Vivian and Grace and Cora, who had refused to wait at the hotel and whom Ethan had given up trying to argue with on the drive in. Henderson was already there when they arrived. He was 61, silver-haired, with the careful grooming of someone who understood that appearance was part of the argument. He looked at Ethan with an expression that didn't change when they made eye contact, which told Ethan that Henderson had decided in advance how to play this moment and was executing that decision. He gave Vivian a nod that was precise and cool, and that she returned with equal precision. David Lester was beside him, and 2 other attorneys Ethan didn't know. 3 board members were already seated. Others arrived over the next 20 minutes, and investors and stakeholders took seats along the sidewall, and the room filled up to about 40 people, which was more than Ethan had expected and which changed the feeling of the room in a way that he registered and then set aside, because thinking about the size of the audience right now wasn't useful. The meeting opened with standard procedural items that took about 25 minutes, and that Ethan spent the way you spend time before something important, outwardly still, inwardly running through the sequence one more time. Then Vivian stood. She made the request for floor time in the proper procedural form, citing her shareholder standing and the board chair. A careful man named Osgood, who clearly knew something significant was about to happen but didn't know exactly what, granted it without objection, because objecting would have created an immediate legal problem, and Osgood had been in boardrooms long enough to know when the path of least short-term resistance was the right path. Vivian spoke for 4 minutes. She introduced the context: her father's final investigation, the sealed briefcase, the flight recorders. with the brevity and precision of someone who understood that the room's attention had a limited window and that she needed to use it to get to Ethan before it narrowed. She was not emotional. She was not performing. She was a woman standing in the headquarters of a company her father had built, telling the people who ran it that they had a problem that had been buried for 20 years and that the burial was over. Then she said, "I'd like to introduce Ethan Mercer, who is the engineer whose work is at the center of this and who is going to walk you through what we found." Ethan stood up. He walked to the front of the room. He looked at the board members, at the investors along the wall, at Lester and his colleagues whose expressions were carefully neutral. He looked briefly at Cora, who was sitting very straight in her chair and whose face said, "You've got this." He opened the presentation. "I'm going to show you 3 things," he said. "What I told this company in 2002. What this company did with what I told them. And what happened because of it." He clicked to the first slide. "Then I'll show you what we found under the ground in Crescent County, Georgia, and what it means for where this company is right now." His voice was steady. He'd made it steady through the same combination of will and tiredness that makes people steady who aren't naturally steady. There was no calm behind it. Not exactly, but there was certainty, and certainty was enough. He went through the engineering report he'd filed in August 2002. Slowly, as Marcus had told him. He let the room read the key passages. He showed the executive response that called his concerns overcautious to a degree that borders on obstructive. He showed Thomas Okafor's subsequent escalation and the silence it received. He showed the email. 4 words. "Stay the course. GP." And he left it on screen for a full 15 seconds before he moved on. And in those 15 seconds, the room was very quiet. He showed the accident data, the official determination. And then, alongside it, Birch's preliminary findings, described carefully, attributed correctly, with the notation that a full formal report was expected within 60 days from the federal investigation, which showed what the flight recorder data actually indicated. He showed the internal documents from Robert Sterling's files, the correspondence that used the phrase "manage the narrative," the correspondence about contingency protocols. He did not editorialize. He put the documents on the screen and read the relevant sections and moved on. At the back of the room, David Lester leaned over to one of his colleagues and said something very quietly. The colleague wrote something on a notepad. Lester's face remained professionally neutral, but his jaw was working in a way that suggested the neutrality was costing him something. Henderson, in his seat at the table, did not look at the screen during the section about the emails. He looked at his hands, folded in front of him. This was, Ethan thought without allowing it to derail him, the tell. He'd shown enough of the hand by looking away from it. Ethan reached the 4th section, the human cost. He slowed down the way Marcus had told him to, and he talked about 3 people in an aircraft on a November morning and what the flight recorder showed about those last 4 minutes. He talked about what a software feedback loop looks like from inside a cockpit, what the crew was experiencing, what they tried to do. He talked about the official determination that had called it pilot error and what it had meant for the families of those 3 people to live with that determination for 20 years. The room was completely still. He talked about what had been done to him afterward, without drama, without making it the center, because it wasn't the center. The engineered termination, the reputation destruction, the years of trying to rebuild on a foundation that someone had deliberately cracked. He said it the way it was. This happened, and it was deliberate. And here's the documentation. And then, remembering what Cora had said, he talked about the Aviation Academy. He said it without apology. He said that Millhaven Airfield was going to become a place where kids who couldn't afford the traditional path into aviation got a chance anyway, and that this was what he was doing with the land, and that this was not separate from everything else he'd said. It was the same thing. It was what you built when you decided that the system had failed, and you weren't going to spend the rest of your life being bitter about it. You built the thing that should have existed. He clicked to the final slide. He looked at the room. "The federal investigation is open," he said. "The evidence is protected. The flight recorder data is on record." He paused. "What you decide today about the governance of this company will be on record too. Every vote will be documented. I want you to know that I know that, and that I think you should vote accordingly." He closed the laptop. He walked back to his seat. The room was quiet for 3 seconds that felt considerably longer. Then 3 people started talking at once, and the room broke into the kind of noise that happens when something contained has been released into the air and nobody quite knows what shape it's going to take. Henderson's attorneys requested a recess immediately, and Osgood granted 15 minutes, and people stood up and moved around, and Ethan sat in his chair, and Cora put her hand briefly on his arm without saying anything, and Vivian, across the table, caught his eye and gave him a very small nod. He didn't feel triumphant. He didn't feel relieved exactly. He felt like a man who had been carrying something heavy for a very long time and had finally set it down in the right place, and his arms were still in the shape of carrying it, and it would take a while for that to change. But the weight was where it needed to be now, in the right room, in front of the right people, with documentation. The 15-minute recess ran to 25, and when the board reconvened, 2 of the 3 members that Grace had identified as potentially persuadable voted against the governance restructuring. Henderson's motion failed by a margin of 1 vote. It wasn't a landslide, it wasn't a declaration, it was 1 vote. But 1 vote was enough. Osgood called for a second motion, a proposal to table all governance restructuring votes pending the conclusion of the federal investigation, and it passed, this time with 4 votes in favor. Henderson sat through both votes with his hands flat on the table and his expression set in a careful blankness that was very practiced and very thin. Lester collected his notes and his colleagues, and they left the room before the meeting formally adjourned. Ethan watched them go. Marcus was waiting in the lobby when they came down, because Marcus had driven up from Ashford that morning without mentioning he was going to do it, and he was standing by the elevator bank in his cleanest flannel shirt, with his arms crossed, and his face doing the thing it did when he was working hard at not showing what he was feeling. "Well?" he said. "We're okay," Ethan said. Marcus looked at him for a moment, then he looked at Cora. Then he uncrossed his arms and said, "There's a diner 2 blocks north that I looked up on the way in. Somebody's buying me lunch." "I'll buy," Vivian said from behind Ethan. Marcus looked at her with the careful, measuring look he'd given her on that first morning, standing in the gravel lot with the egg sandwiches. Something in it shifted. "All right," he said. "Let's go." They went out through the lobby and into the Atlanta afternoon. 5 people who'd arrived at this day from different directions and through different damage, and the sun was on the glass of the buildings, and the city was doing what cities do, which is continue, regardless. And Ethan walked out into it with the knowledge that the work wasn't finished, and that finished wasn't the point, and that the 1 vote and the open investigation and the flight recorder data sitting in Birch's lab were not an ending, but a direction. A direction was what he'd been missing for 20 years. He had one now. The diner 2 blocks north turned out to be the kind of place that hadn't changed its menu or its booth, though upholstery since sometime in the 90s, and Marcus ordered like he'd been planning it the whole drive up from Ashford. A patty melt, a side of fries, and a chocolate shake that he split with Cora without either of them discussing it first, the way people split things when they've decided they like each other. Vivian ordered a club sandwich and ate maybe a third of it. Ethan ordered coffee and eventually, at Grace's insistence, a grilled cheese, because Grace said a man who hadn't eaten anything but coffee and adrenaline since 6 that morning was not a man who should be making decisions. And she was right, and he knew she was right, and he ate the sandwich. Nobody talked about the meeting for the first 10 minutes. That was its own kind of relief. Sitting in a booth with people who didn't need him to perform victory or analyze strategy, who just wanted to eat lunch and let the last 6 hours settle into something he could actually feel instead of just execute. It was Cora who finally said it. 1 vote, she said, turning her milkshake glass slowly on the table. That's not a lot of margin. It's not, Ethan agreed. Does that worry you? He thought about it honestly before answering, because she'd earned an honest answer, and she always knew when she wasn't getting one. A little, he said. Henderson's not finished. Men like that don't get talked out of something by 1 vote going the wrong way. They regroup. He turned his coffee cup a quarter turn on the table, an old habit. But the investigation's open now. That's the part that matters most. Whatever he does next, he's doing it with federal eyes already on the company. That changes his options. It doesn't eliminate them, Grace said, not unkindly. She'd ordered a salad and was eating it with the brisk efficiency of someone who treated meals as fuel rather than pleasure. He'll likely try a procedural challenge to slow the federal process. He may also try something more personal, pressure on individual board members, maybe pressure on you directly, financial or otherwise. She looked at Ethan over her fork. I want you prepared for that. Today was a win. It's not the end of the fight. I know, Ethan said. I just want it said out loud so nobody at this table goes home tonight thinking it's over. Vivian, who'd been quiet for most of the meal, finally spoke. It's not over for me either, she said. Even if the investigation concludes exactly the way we expect, even if Henderson is removed entirely, I still have a company that spent 20 years protecting a defect instead of fixing it. That doesn't get solved by one board vote. That's a culture. Cultures don't change because of a single afternoon. She looked at her sandwich without eating it. My father built something he was proud of, and then he let it become something he wasn't, and I don't know yet how much of that is going to be on me to undo. Nobody had a tidy answer to that, and nobody offered one, which Ethan thought was probably the most honest thing about the table just then. That everyone there understood some problems don't resolve in an afternoon, no matter how good the afternoon was. They drove back to Millhaven that evening in 2 vehicles, Marcus following Ethan's truck most of the way, Vivian and Grace in a car behind them, and somewhere around the county line, Ethan's phone buzzed with a text from Phyllis. Tillis called. NTSB officially reopening the N774-SR determination. Formal. On the record. Call me tomorrow, not tonight. Go home and sleep. He read it twice at a stoplight and then handed the phone to Cora in the passenger seat so she could read it too. She read it, looked at it for a long moment, and then said quietly, Daddy. Yeah. It's real now, like official real. Yeah, he said. It is. She didn't say anything else for a while. When he glanced over a few minutes later, she had her head tipped back against the seat and her eyes were wet. Not crying exactly, just full, the way eyes get when something that's been waiting a long time finally has somewhere to go. The weeks that followed didn't move with the drama of the board meeting. They moved the way real consequences move, slowly, administratively, through documents and findings and statements that took their proper bureaucratic time. The NTSB's formal re-examination ran 12 weeks. Birch's lab produced the full technical report, peer-reviewed by 2 outside specialists the agency brought in, specifically because the case had become, in the agency's internal language, high visibility, which was a polite way of saying that several news outlets had finally caught up to the actual story, instead of the one Henderson's people had tried to plant first. The full report, when it came, did not equivocate. It found that the original 2003 determination of pilot error had relied on an investigation record that had been materially altered, that the flight data recorder evidence demonstrated a software-induced control feedback event consistent with the defect Ethan had flagged in 2002, and that the crew's response had been appropriate and could not reasonably have prevented the outcome given the time available. It named Gerald Pratt, posthumously, as the executive who had directed the suppression of the original findings. It noted, in careful regulatory language, that several individuals still employed by Sterling Aerospace Systems appeared to have had knowledge of the suppression at the time it occurred, and it referred those names to the Department of Justice for further review. Raymond Henderson's name was not among the individuals referred. He joined the board 4 years after the accident, but the report's existence, its plain, unambiguous language, its public release, did something to him that no single board vote could have done. It made him radioactive. Institutional investors who had been quietly supporting his consolidation of power began making calls of their own, asking questions that had not previously seemed urgent. 2 of the board members who'd voted with him in the first meeting reversed their position entirely once the report came out, not because they'd developed a conscience overnight, but because staying associated with him had become, in the specific calculus that governs people like that, bad business. The second board vote, 8 weeks after the first, removed Henderson from his position as chairman. It wasn't unanimous. Nothing involving that many competing interests is ever unanimous. But it was decisive, 11-4, and it happened in a room with considerably more reporters outside than the first meeting had drawn, because by then the story had a name and a face and an arc that people wanted to follow. Vivian was elected to the chairmanship that same afternoon. She called Ethan from the car immediately afterward, and he could hear in her voice the same thing he'd felt walking out of that lobby weeks earlier. Not triumph, exactly. Something quieter and heavier. The weight of having gotten what you wanted and realizing the work was just beginning in a different shape. "I have to tell you something," she said, "before it's public." "Okay." "The board's offering you a settlement," she said. "Not from Henderson. He's gone. From the company. From me, really, since I'm running it now. It's significant, Ethan. It's enough to set you up for the rest of your life. Core's tuition, the academy, all of it, fully funded, no strings, plus compensation for what was done to you professionally over the last 20 years. She paused. "I want you to actually consider it. I know what you said in my hangar 3 months ago about deciding what happens with the truth yourself. This isn't me trying to buy anything from you. This is the company finally trying to do the smallest part of what it owes you." He sat with that for a long moment, out on the runway where he'd been running conduit when she called, with the August evening coming down gold over the grass and the cracked asphalt and the windsock he still hadn't replaced. "Can I think about it?" he said. "Of course." He thought about it for 3 days, which was longer than he'd expected to need and shorter than the decision probably deserved. He talked to Cora about it on the phone, and she said carefully that it wasn't her decision and she'd support whatever he chose. And then she said, because she was 19 and still learning when to hold back and when not to. "But for what it's worth, I don't think you need the money to prove anything. I think you've already proven it." He talked to Marcus about it too, sitting on the tailgate of the truck one evening with 2 beers between them, and Marcus said, in his characteristic economy, "You don't need my opinion. You already know what you're going to do. You're just walking around the edges of it because saying no to that kind of money feels like it should be harder than it actually is." "Is that a guess, or do you actually know?" "I've known you 15 years, Marcus said. "I know." He was right, mostly. Ethan had known what he was going to do somewhere around the second day, sitting in the hangar with the documents from Robert Sterling's briefcase spread out on the table. The same table where Vivian had set that briefcase down, soaked from the storm 3 months earlier. He'd known it the way you know things in your body before your mind catches up and gives you the words for it. He called Vivian on the 4th day. "I'm not taking the settlement," he said. "Ethan, let me finish," he said. "I'm not taking it for myself. I appreciate it. I believe you mean it the right way, and I believe the company owes exactly what you said it owes. But if I take a personal payout, here's what happens. The story becomes about money. It becomes a guy who found some buried evidence and got a big check for it. That's not what this was. That's not what I want it to have been." He paused. "What I want instead is for the company to fund the academy. Publicly. As part of the restitution. Not because I personally need the money, but because every kid who comes through that program should know exactly why it exists and what it costs to build it. I want it tied to what happened, not separate from it." There was a silence on the line. "And Chen and Halverson," he added. "Wherever they are, whatever they're doing now. I want them found, and I want them offered the same recognition. Their names cleared the same way mine is being cleared. And I want something set up for Thomas Okafor's family. He filed the same warning I did and died before anyone ever said he was right." Vivian was quiet for a moment longer. When she spoke, her voice had something in it he hadn't heard from her before. Not the controlled precision she usually carried. Something looser, more affected. "My father would have liked that answer," she said. "More than he'd have liked you taking the money." "I figured," Ethan said. "I'll bring it to the board," she said. "I think it'll pass easily. Honestly, I think it'll look better for the company than a quiet settlement would have. The optics of restitution that actually does something, that's not nothing, even cynically speaking. I don't care much about the optics." "I know," she said. "That's exactly why it'll work." It took another 2 months to formalize. Corporate restitution doesn't move at the speed of a handshake, no matter how sincerely meant. But by late autumn, the framework was set. Sterling Aerospace Systems established an endowed fund for the Millhaven Aviation Academy, sufficient to cover full scholarships for an initial cohort of 40 students and to fund the facility's operating costs for a decade, with a board-level commitment to ongoing support after that. The company located Rosalind Chen, who'd left the industry entirely after the original program ended, and was now teaching high school physics in Sacramento, and Marcus Halverson, who'd stayed in aerospace under a different employer and had spent 20 years assuming nobody would ever connect his old work to what had happened. Both were offered formal recognition, and more importantly to both of them, formal correction of their professional records. Chen cried on the phone when Ethan called to tell her himself. Halverson, more guarded, asked a lot of careful questions before he let himself believe it, which Ethan understood completely, because he'd have done the same. A scholarship in Thomas Okafor's name was established for engineering students with a specific focus on safety-critical systems, funded permanently, administered independently of the company so that no future leadership could quietly let it lapse. Ethan flew to Houston to meet Okafor's widow, a calm, careful woman named Patrice, who had raised 2 kids essentially alone after her husband's sudden death, and who had spent 15 years believing, on some level she'd never been able to fully suppress, that there was something more to that heart attack than the doctors had told her. There wasn't anything more, medically. The strain in his life in those last years, though, the unrelenting weight of having tried and failed to stop something terrible and then watching it happen anyway, that was a different kind of contributing cause, the kind that doesn't show up on an autopsy report. Ethan didn't tell her that directly. He didn't need to. She understood it already, in the way people understand the things that happen to the person they loved best, even when nobody ever explains it to them properly. "He talked about you," she told Ethan, sitting in her kitchen in Houston with 2 cups of coffee, neither of them finished. Not by name, not really, not after the first couple of years, but he talked about the other engineer who saw it too. Like there was some comfort in knowing he hadn't been alone in seeing it, even if neither of you could stop it. She looked at him. "I'm glad you finally got to be more than the other engineer to somebody." He didn't trust his voice enough to answer that right away. 18 months after the night Vivian Sterling's jet came down through a storm onto a runway that wasn't supposed to be open, Millhaven Airfield did not look anything like the property Ethan had bought for $240,000 with nearly everything he had. The old control building had been renovated into classrooms and a flight planning center. The hangar, the same hangar where he'd first heard Vivian Sterling say his name like it meant something, now housed 3 training aircraft and a simulator bay, with the original folding table where they'd spread out Robert Sterling's documents preserved, slightly absurdly but deliberately, in a corner of the new student lounge with a small brass plate that nobody had asked Ethan's permission to install, and that he'd decided, after some initial embarrassment, to leave exactly where it was. The underground facility had been transformed too, though that had taken longer and more careful work than the rest of it, because Ethan had insisted on doing it right rather than doing it fast. It was open to the public now, several days a week, as something between a museum and a memorial. The experimental aircraft restored to static display, the original nameplate still riveted to its nose, the 4 names readable under proper lighting for the first time in 2 decades. A small exhibit walked visitors through the timeline. The original engineering concerns, the suppressed findings, the recovered recorders, the federal investigation, the restoration. It didn't flinch from any of it. Ethan had been firm about that in every planning conversation. He didn't want a sanitized version. He wanted something that told a kid standing in that room exactly what speaking up had cost, and exactly what staying silent had also cost, so that they understood neither path was free of weight, but one of them was at least honest. Cora had finished her degree that spring and had come to work at the academy for what she called a gap year, and what Ethan privately suspected was going to become considerably longer than a year, given how she talked about the place now, with the specific possessiveness of someone who'd helped build something and didn't want to hand it off to anyone else's care just yet. She ran the avionics curriculum for the most advanced students, the ones close to finishing the program, and she taught it the way her father had once taught himself, with a stubborn insistence that students understand not just how systems worked, but what happened when nobody listened to the engineers who noticed something was wrong. "You're basically teaching them your dad's whole life as a case study," Marcus observed one afternoon, watching her run a session through the hangar's wide observation window. He'd become something close to a permanent fixture at Millhaven himself, splitting his time between his machine shop and a part-time role maintaining the Academy's aircraft, which he'd taken on with the gruff insistence that he was doing it as a favor and not because he liked it, a claim nobody who knew him believed for a second. She is, Ethan said. I think it's the right case study. I think so too, Marcus said. Doesn't make it easy to watch, though. Watching your kid grow up to fix the thing that broke you. There's something in that that gets you in the chest. Ethan didn't argue with that. There was something in it. Vivian visited twice a month, sometimes more, flying down in a different, considerably less dramatic jet than the one that had first brought her crashing into his life in a storm. She'd reformed Sterling Aerospace's internal reporting structure from the ground up in the 18 months since the board vote, a formal whistleblower protection framework with real teeth, an engineering review board with authority that bypassed executive override entirely on any safety-critical concern, and an external audit requirement triggered automatically whenever an internal safety flag was overruled by leadership, with the audit results going directly and unfilterably to the full board. It was, by every account Ethan had heard from people inside the industry, one of the most aggressive internal accountability structures any major aerospace contractor had ever adopted, and it had cost the company some short-term efficiency and a noticeable amount of executive grumbling, and Vivian had not budged an inch on any of it. My father built a culture that protected the company instead of the people who flew in what it made, she told Ethan once, standing at the edge of the restored runway on one of her visits, watching a student solo for the first time, the small aircraft lifting off cleanly into a clear October sky. I'm not interested in protecting the company anymore. I'm interested in protecting the people. If the company survives that priority, fine. If it doesn't, that's not actually the tragedy people would assume it is. It'll survive, Ethan said. Companies that stop lying to themselves usually do better, not worse. They just don't believe that until they try it. You sound very certain for someone who's never run a company. I've run a life, he said. Different scale. Same principle. She laughed at that. A real one. And they stood there for a while without talking, watching the student bring the aircraft around for a second pass, the kind of quiet that two people share when they've been through something together and don't need to narrate it to each other anymore. That evening, after Vivian had left for the small Airfield hotel where she stayed on her visits, rather than the trailer Ethan had long since traded for a proper house on the property, Ethan walked out to the underground facility alone, the way he did sometimes when the day had been full and he needed somewhere quiet to put the leftover weight of it. He went down the ladder, through the corridor, into the room where the restored aircraft sat under careful lighting, 4 names on its nose. He stood in front of it for a long time. He thought about the man he'd been at 30 before any of this happened. Confident, technically gifted, certain that doing good work and telling the truth about problems was simply what you did, that the system existed to listen if you raised your hand properly and clearly enough. He thought about the man he'd become in the years after, quieter, harder, carrying a story he'd mostly stopped telling because telling it and watching people not quite believe it had become its own particular kind of exhausting. And he thought about the man standing here now, 52 years old, in a building he owned, looking at proof that the worst thing that ever happened to him had also, eventually, become the foundation of the best thing he'd ever built. He didn't think the universe balanced itself out neatly. He'd lived through enough years of it not balancing to know better than that. Thomas Okafor was still dead at 44, and that hadn't been undone by any board vote or any scholarship fund, however well-intentioned. The 3 people on that aircraft in November 2003 were still gone, and their families had spent 20 years grieving people the official record had quietly blamed for their own deaths, and no amount of corrected paperwork gave those years back to them. Some things broke and stayed broken. He'd learned that the hard way, and he wasn't going to pretend otherwise standing in front of an old airplane just because the ending had turned out better than he'd had any right to expect. What he believed instead, what he'd come to believe slowly over the 18 months since the storm, was something smaller and more useful than balance. He believed that telling the truth, even 20 years late, even after it cost you everything once already, still mattered. Not because it fixed what was broken. It didn't, not entirely, not ever completely. But because the alternative, staying quiet, letting the lie stand because the lie was comfortable and the truth was expensive, meant the next person who saw a problem and tried to raise their hand would learn exactly the wrong lesson from watching what happened to him. He hadn't been able to protect himself 20 years ago, but he could make sure that the kids coming through this academy, the ones learning avionics in the hangar where this whole thing started, understood that speaking up had a cost and was still worth it anyway. That was the whole lesson, distilled down to the only version of it simple enough to actually teach. He heard footsteps on the ladder behind him and turned to find Cora coming down, still in her work clothes from the afternoon session, a thermos in one hand. "Figured you'd be down here," she said. "You always come down here on the hard days." It wasn't a hard day. "You've got the face," she said, sitting down on the edge of the old workbench. "The one you get when you're thinking about people who aren't here anymore." He sat down next to her. She handed him the thermos without being asked, and he took a drink, and it was just coffee, ordinary and a little too strong, and somehow exactly what he needed. "You did good today," she said. "The student who soloed. Marcus told me you stood out there the whole time like you were the one flying it." "Felt like it, a little." "That's the job," she said. "I think that's basically the whole job. Standing on the ground caring more than you're supposed to about somebody else getting to fly." She looked at the restored aircraft in front of them, at the 4 names on its nose, hers reading them again the way she always did when she came down here, like checking that something important was still where she'd left it. "I used to think you bought this place because you were having some kind of crisis. Aunt Donna told me that actually, way back when you first bought it, she said you'd lost your mind." "She told me that too." "I think she was wrong," Cora said. "I think you knew something the rest of us didn't. I don't know if you knew it consciously, but some part of you walked onto this runway and felt like it was waiting for you, and it was right. It was waiting for you, the whole time. 20 years, and it just sat here in the dark, waiting for you to come finish what they tried to bury." Ethan looked at the aircraft, at his name, last alphabetically, riveted in aluminum, no longer hidden, no longer denied. "Yeah," he said. "Maybe it was." They sat there a while longer, father and daughter, in the quiet underground room that had once been a grave for the truth and was now simply a room where people came to remember what the truth had cost and what it had ultimately built. Above them, the restored runway lights would be coming on soon for the evening pattern work, the same lights Ethan had been repairing the night the storm rolled in and changed everything, and somewhere out past the tree line the sky was doing the slow gold work of an October evening settling into night. Tomorrow, there would be more students, more lessons, more small private victories that nobody outside this airfield would ever know about, and that mattered anyway. The work wasn't finished. It never really would be. That wasn't how any of this worked. Not the company, not the academy, not the slow business of making sure the next generation understood what their predecessors had paid to get them here. But it was moving in the right direction now. After 20 years of moving in the wrong one, and Ethan Mercer had learned, the long and expensive way, that direction was sometimes the only thing you got to choose, and that choosing it anyway, every single day, was the whole of what courage actually looked like once you stripped away everything dramatic and left just the ordinary, stubborn, daily decision to keep going. He finished the coffee. He handed the thermos back to his daughter, and together they climbed back up the ladder into the last of the evening light toward whatever the next day was going to ask of them.